Last year, I made a 10-part series on teaching logical redstone, which, if you didn't know, is using redstone to make things like calculators, games, and computers. So if you've seen this series already, there's nothing new here. But if not, sit back, relax, and enjoy learning logical redstone. For this entire series, I'm going to use version 1.18.2 of Minecraft Java Edition. Why 118? Well, it doesn't matter that much, but 118 is the version of the most popular logical redstone servers at the time of uploading this. If you use a slightly different version like 117 or 119 and you play in single player, then everything in this series will probably still work. What matters more is that you play in Java Edition, not Bedrock Edition. If you try to build anything from this series on Bedrock, there's a chance it just won't work at all. So I really do not recommend trying that. I would explain why I prefer Java over Bedrock, but my friend Purplers did a beautiful job doing that already. So if you're interested in that, check out his video in the description. Now, another thing you might want to know is how to make a good world for redstone. Obviously, there's a ton of freedom here, but here's what I like to do. On Create New World, I make it creative, turn cheats on, and set the difficulty to peaceful. Then in the game rules section, I like to turn off all the spawning stuff, drop stuff, and world update stuff too. Those three categories are just annoying for redstone. And in world options, I like to turn structures off, and I choose the super flat preset called Redstone Ready. And just like that, you have a beautiful world for redstone. One last thing you might want to set up for yourself before getting started is a texture pack, because in my opinion, the vanilla textures are not that great. There are so many options out there for texture packs. Personally, I use one I made called the Matte Pack, and the link for it is in the description. It's mostly just a mixture of packs made by other people that I put together. The first thing to understand about redstone, and really Minecraft in general, is that the game runs on a tick system. There are 20 game ticks per second, and so each game tick is a 20th of a second. Now, the kind of weird thing is, game ticks are actually not used that often to measure time in the logical redstone community. Instead, we often measure things in terms of redstone ticks, which are defined as 10 per second, not 20. In other words, every 2 game ticks is equal to 1 redstone tick. This is because a lot of redstone components operate on a 2 game tick clock anyways, so I guess it's just kind of easier. But the point is, from here on out, including this video, whenever I say ticks, I'm referring to redstone ticks, which are 1/10 of a second. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the most common components in logical redstone: dust, repeaters, comparators, and torches. Redstone dust is the classic. It's essentially the wire that you use to transmit redstone signals. You can place it on almost any flat surface in the game, from solid blocks to glass to even upside down half slabs, but it can't exist without something under it. Each individual dust has a signal strength associated with it, which is just a value from 0 to 15. 0 being no power, all the way up to 15 being full power. One way to give redstone full power is by placing a power source, like a redstone block. As you can see, the adjacent dust receives a full signal strength of 15. Then, that value decays by 1 for every dust along the wire, until eventually it reaches 0. But before it reaches 0, you can use redstone to power things. For example, I can power a redstone lamp by hooking up a small wire to it and powering the wire. And if you're only using dust, then this transmission is instantaneous. There's no delay. Okay, but if signal strength always decays to 0, then how do we transmit longer signals? For that, we need a redstone repeater. A repeater converts any signal from 1 through 15 into a signal of 15. For example, if I have a long redstone line which doesn't quite reach, I can use a repeater to repeat the signal and keep it going. This comes at a cost though, because repeaters introduce delay. By default, a repeater introduces 1 tick of delay, which literally means that the time from this dust being powered to this dust being powered is 1 tick, or 1/10 of a second. You can also right-click a repeater to change that delay to 2 ticks, 3 ticks, or 4 ticks. 4 is the maximum, and if you right-click again, it just goes back to 1. Repeaters can also repeat signals from other repeaters, or really any other power source. And a really cool feature of repeaters is that they can be locked by powering them from the side with another repeater or comparator. This makes them hold their current state of either powered or unpowered. Okay, now before I move on to comparators, let's talk about what happens when you power solid blocks with redstone. There are actually 2 types of power that solid blocks can receive: soft power, which I'll represent with orange, and hard power, which I'll represent with red. If you power a solid block with redstone dust, like this, that block becomes soft powered. Additionally, any solid blocks that redstone dust is sitting on directly also become soft powered. But if you power a solid block with a repeater, it becomes hard powered. Both soft powered and hard powered blocks are very similar. They can both activate components next to them, like lamps or doors. They can also both conduct to repeaters and comparators, and by extension, this means that you can actually pass signals through walls like this. The main difference is that a soft-powered block will not activate redstone around it, whereas a hard-powered block will. Alright, with that out of the way, let's move on to comparators. Unlike repeaters that have one input, comparators have three inputs, the rear and the two sides. Comparators have a delay of 1 tick, which is the same as a default repeater. They also have two different modes, indicated by the little knob on the front. By default, when you place them, they're in compare mode. But if you right-click and turn that little knob on, they change to subtract mode. Now, if you're not using the side inputs and you're just using the rear, a comparator is actually really simple. All it does is copy the signal strength from the rear to the output. For example, if I give it a signal strength of 7, it outputs a 7. It's basically a worse version of a repeater. But if you choose to use the side inputs, then the mode it's in actually matters. In compare mode, if either of the two side inputs are greater than the rear, it outputs a 0. Otherwise, it keeps outputting the rear, like normal. For example, if I have an 8 in the rear and a 7 and 9 on the sides, well, 9 is greater than 8, so we output 0. But if I have an 8 in the rear and 5 and 6 in the sides, well, neither of them is greater than 8, so we just keep outputting 8. Switching to subtract mode, now the comparator will actually perform a subtraction. It takes the rear minus the greater of the two sides and outputs the result. So if I have a 3 in the rear and a 1 and 2 in the sides, the comparator will do 3 minus the greater of the two sides, which is 2, and 3 minus 2 is 1. As another example, if I have a 3 in the rear and a 4 in the side, the comparator will do 3 minus 4, which is negative 1. But signal strength never goes below 0, so it actually just outputs a 0. And this leads to a really cool property of subtract mode, which is that if you give full power to the side, nothing can get through. You've essentially canceled this comparator, because anything minus 15 is going to be 0 or less. And I'll be honest with you, subtract mode is a lot more common in logical redstone. I almost never use compare mode. Just like repeaters, comparators hard power blocks, and on top of that, they can pass signal strength through blocks. If I give it a 7 in the rear, hard power a block, and place a redstone dust, we get a 7. Another super useful feature of comparators is that they can tell you how full a container is. For example, if I have a barrel completely full of items, then a comparator will read 15. If it's only somewhat full, I get a signal strength that is a representative fraction of how full it is. Maybe a 7 or 8 if it's halfway, or a 13 if it's mostly full, you get the idea. And naturally, if it's empty, you get a 0. Alright, last but not least is the redstone torch. Redstone torches are power sources that give off full power. They can be placed on the top or side of a block. They hard power blocks above them, and they can activate stuff next to them. This includes underneath them if they're on the side of a block. The only exception is the block they're attached to, which is completely unaffected. However, if you power the block they're attached to, the redstone torch becomes unpowered. This can be used to invert a redstone signal, and the inversion has a delay of 1 tick. If a redstone torch inverts too many times too quickly, it's possible for it to burn out, and it will stay burnt out until it receives an update. And that concludes the 4 main components used in logical redstone. Of course, there are still pistons, observers, hoppers, and more, but those just don't get used very often. And in my opinion, if you're not moving blocks, I feel like you just never need to use pistons. In my experience, no matter what circuit I'm designing, I tend to find cleaner solutions using just these guys. These 4 components will allow you to do pretty much whatever you want in a clean and elegant way. Next up, let's talk about the most important blocks for logical redstone. I already talked about solid blocks and how they can be soft-powered or hard-powered. But another really useful block type is transparent blocks. Some common transparent blocks are glass, glowstone, ice, or upside-down slabs. Me personally, I use glass the most. Transparent blocks have 2 really useful properties. First, redstone can only travel up onto a transparent block, but not down. This gives you a really easy way to make one-way wires. And second, if you place a transparent block on top of a redstone staircase, the redstone can still slip through it, compared to solid blocks, which would block the redstone from getting through. This has some really cool side effects, like being able to create a glass tower to send redstone straight upwards. Or, let's say I have two redstone wires and I want to move them both down by one block. I can't do that with solid blocks because, well, the redstone on the bottom wire is getting blocked off. But if I instead use a glass here, the redstone slips through, and it works. There's no more interference between these two wires. That's pretty cool. Another useful block is the target block. A target block is a solid block with a special property that any redstone dust placed next to it will be automatically pointed to it. This is really useful when it comes to compacting redstone circuits. Target blocks also give off a signal when hit by a projectile, but that's not really used in logical redstone. We just like them for the redirecting property. Next, we have the redstone block. As you saw earlier, it gives full power to redstone next to it. That includes redstone on top of it and underneath it. And finally, containers are pretty useful as well. They can be used with a comparator to create any signal strength you want on the fly. Alright, we've got tons of components and blocks now. This is really cool. The last thing you might want to use when you create circuits is some form of input and output. Starting with input, the main ones I like to use are levers, buttons, and pressure plates. Levers are pretty simple. They just attach to a block. When they're turned on by a player, they hard power that block. Buttons also attach to blocks. When they're pressed by a player, they hard power that block with a short pulse. A stone button pulse is 10 ticks long, while a wooden button pulse is 15 ticks long. Pressure plates can only be placed on top of blocks. They hard power the block underneath them whenever you or another entity is standing on them. And by the way, levers, buttons, and pressure plates can also activate things around them. Now for output, there are only two real options in my opinion: redstone lamps and trapdoors. Redstone lamps are the classic. They simply light up when they're powered. Anytime you want to read a signal or make a screen, they're super useful. The only flaw about redstone lamps is that while they turn on instantly, they take 2 ticks to realize that they're not being powered anymore. This can actually be really annoying when you're trying to read the state of a circuit, because during those 2 ticks, it's not really telling you the correct state. Luckily though, trapdoors don't have that problem. They update instantly both ways, so you can always rely on them to give you an accurate reading of a circuit at any time. And I'm such a fan of this property that my texture pack actually retextures trapdoors that are on the side of blocks to look like lamps. And that concludes input and output. At this point, you've learned literally everything commonly used in logical redstone. If you're brand new to this and this seemed like a ton of information, you're right. It was. But I promise you, after just a few weeks of playing around with redstone yourself, all of these properties become second nature. My brain doesn't even think about redstone in terms of like soft powering and hard powering anymore. I've just internalized how it behaves, and I think most people get to that point pretty quickly. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is mods. Don't get me wrong, all the redstone we build will always work in the vanilla version of the game, but there are some mods that are incredibly useful for redstone building. My 2 favorites are World Edit and Carpet. These are both fabric mods, so you'll need to learn how to install fabric first. I've left a bunch of links in the description for how to do that. It's not that bad. Once you've installed World Edit and Carpet, come back to this part of the video and I'll show you how I use them. Let's start with World Edit. The idea of World Edit is to create a selection and then run commands that manipulate the world to help you build faster. To make a selection, start by running //wand. This gives you the default selection tool, which is a wooden axe. Left-click a block to set the first corner of your selection, and right-click a block to set the second corner. All the space between those 2 corners is your selection. World Edit has a ton of commands, but I really only use like 5 of them. Set, move, copy, paste, and stack. Let's do a really quick rundown of how these work. Set will set your selection to a block. For example, if I want to set the floor to stone, I would select the first corner, then the second corner, and run //set stone. You can also use set to remove things by setting the area to air. So if I run //set air, the floor gets removed. Move moves your selection. For example, if I want to move this circuit by 3 blocks up, I would select the circuit like this, and then I'd run //move 3 up. Or I can also just look up and run //move 3. Copy and paste are used to, well, copy and paste. For example, let's say I want to copy this circuit and paste it somewhere else. First, I select it, then I run / copy, go over here and run / paste. And lastly, we have stack. Stack is really useful when you want to copy something a bunch of times. For example, if I have a repeater here and I want to have 10 more repeaters just like it, all I need to do is select the repeater and run / stack 10. It will then copy and paste it 10 more times in the direction that I'm looking. WorldEdit also has some flags that I use sometimes. The most common one is -A. If you include this flag when you run a command, it will ignore error. So let's say I want to move this piece into this piece. By default, if I try to do that, it won't work, because selections always have straight edges. But if I run the same command with -A, it perfectly fits, because it didn't move the error. Now let's talk about Carpet Mod. Just like with WorldEdit, there's a ton of stuff in this mod, but I only use a few things. First, they have a toggle called Creative NoClip that you can enable with this command right here. It allows you to fly through blocks, but you still land on them when you stop flying. And that is just so useful when you're trying to build tight circuits. I also use Carpet Mod to speed up, slow down, or even freeze the game. As I said in the beginning, there are 20 game ticks per second, but you can change that with tick rate. For example, running /tick rate 5 will slow down the game to 5 ticks per second, or 1/4 speed. On the flip side, running /tick rate 500 will speed up the game a ton. You can also freeze the game with /tick freeze. Once the game is frozen, you can step through time with /tick step. For example, if I want to jump ahead by 1 redstone tick or 2 game ticks, I would run /tick step 2. And to unfreeze the game, just run tick freeze again. Hi guys, and welcome to episode 2 of Logical Redstone Reloaded. Last episode, I went over the basics of every redstone component you'll need and how to use fabric mods. Now, as much as I want to start building cool circuits, we have to cover a few more fundamentals first. Specifically, we need to learn about number systems. If I were to describe Logical Redstone in one word, it would probably be numbers. Numbers make so many things possible, from calculators to game systems to fully fledged CPUs. But how much about numbers do you really need to learn for Redstone? I mean, assuming you're above 5 years old, you already know what numbers are and how to use them. Well, as it turns out, the way you learn to think about numbers as a kid is not the only way to do it. It's just the most popular one. At some point, you were probably told that there are 10 digits, 0 through 9. But why are there 10 digits? What if you only had 5 or 7? Would that break things? And if it doesn't break things, how can we exploit it to become better Redstoners? To explore these questions, let's go back to school for a second and take a deeper look at how our number system works. Our number system is called base 10, or decimal. It's a positional number system, which means that the value of any digit depends on its position. If a digit is all the way to the right on a number, it's in the ones place. But every place value to the left gets 10 times more valuable. And if you go to the right, even beyond the decimal point, the place values get 10 times less valuable. For example, the number 321 literally represents 3 times 100 plus 2 times 10 plus 1 times 1. But why do we do this? Why do place values have this relationship? Well, I think the easiest way to see why is by counting. Let's say that all you have is the ones place and you want to count up as high as possible. So you start at 0 and start counting up. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. And at this point, you've counted up 9 times, you've stayed completely in the ones place, so there's no problem. But if you want to count up one more time, you have an issue. There's no symbol you can put in the ones place to signify a 10. So without making a new symbol, how do you signify that you've counted up 10 times? I mean, you can make another ones place, but then what's going to happen when you get to 30 or 40? That strategy won't scale very well. The genius of our number system is to instead create a new column with more value, the tens place. By doing so, I can package up all the work I did in the ones place into a single digit in the tens place. This 1 is all I need to show that I counted up 10 times. And that's why place values have this relationship. In base 10, every 10 counts of work you do in one place value is equal to 1 count of work in the next place value. Okay, now that we have a good understanding of base 10, let's go back to my earlier question. What if you don't have 10 symbols? Well, let's try it out. Let's say we're using a new number system where there are only 4 symbols, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Just like before, I'll start with a 0 in the ones place and count up. 1, 2, 3. And I ran into a similar problem. There's nothing I can put in the ones place to make a 4. At least, not with these symbols. So a good solution would be to make a 4's place and put a 1 there. To be super clear, what we're saying here is that the number 1, 0 represents 4 in this new system, because it's 1, 4 and 0, 1s. And that's pretty weird, right? We're so used to seeing 1, 0 and automatically thinking that it means 10. But that's only true in base 10. In this new system that I just created, 1, 0 means 4. And naturally, we'll keep multiplying the place values by 4 as they go to the left. 4's place, 16's place, 64's place, etc. As you might have guessed already, this number system is called base 4. And the amazing thing is, nothing broke. There's nothing wrong with expressing numbers in base 4 instead of base 10. In fact, every number in base 10 has a base 4 equivalent. For example, 32 in base 10, or 32, is 200 in base 4. 3 10s and 2 1s is equivalent to 2 16s. And speaking even more generally, you can express numbers in whatever base you want. Let's say I wanted to express 123 in base 7. The base 7 place values are going to multiply by 7, so 1, 7, 49, etc. And I can only use 7 symbols, 0 through 6. As it turns out, 123 is made up of 2 49s, 3 7s, and 4 1s. So 2, 3, 4 is 123 in base 7. Okay, now we know how bases work, and it's clear that every base is an equally valid number system. So if our goal is to express numbers with Redstone, which base should we use? Well, if we pick a base that naturally resembles the state of Redstone, it'll probably make things a lot easier. There are 2 common ways to view the state of Redstone. You can view it as just on or off, giving you 2 different states, or you can view it in terms of its signal strength, which gives you 16 different states, 0 all the way to 15. As a result, the most common bases to use with Redstone numbers are base 2 and base 16. Let's talk about base 2 first. Base 2 is also called binary. It uses 2 symbols, 0 and 1. Typically, Redstone that's off is used to represent 0, and on represents 1. Just like every other base, we start with the 1's place, and then the place values scale by the base. In this case, they go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. As a quick example, let's convert 25 into binary. I can make 25 with 1 16, 1 8, and 1 1. I don't need anything else, so let's fill these in with zeros. And there we go. 25 in binary is 11001. If you're brand new to binary and want some more practice, try these conversions out. Getting comfortable with binary is really important for logical Redstone, so I highly recommend it. For some terminology, a single 0 or 1 can also be referred to as a bit. Therefore, 25 in binary is 5 bits long. Just be a little careful with that though, because, for example, 25 can also be an 8-bit number. All you have to do is add 3 more zeros to the left, and now you have an 8-bit representation for the number 25. And by the way, 8 bits is so commonly used in computer science that it actually has a special name. It's called a byte. With that being said, let me ask you a question. How many different numbers can you represent with 1 byte of information? Pause the video now if you'd like to try to find the answer. Alright, welcome back. The correct answer is 256. There's a few different ways you could have gotten that answer. You could have looked at it as a combinatorics problem. I have 2 choices for each bit, and so 2 times 2 times 2 8 times, or 2 to the power of 8, is 256. You could have also noticed that the smallest number we can represent with 8 bits is 0, while the biggest number is 255, and the range from 0 to 255 has 256 values. Either way is equally valid. The point is, in general, n bits of binary can represent 2 to the n unique values. Now let's talk about hexadecimal. Hexadecimal has 16 symbols because it's base 16, 0 through 9, and then A, B, C, D, E, F. You don't usually see letters in numbers, so this can be kind of weird to get used to. But the most natural way to view it is that A means 10, B means 11, all the way to F means 15. And as expected, our place values go 1, 16, 256, etc. So, as an example, let's figure out what the hexadecimal value 9BF is in decimal. We have 9 times 256 plus 11 times 16, because B is 11, plus 15 times 1, because F is 15. After doing the math, we can see that 9BF in hexadecimal is equal to 2,495. And yeah, there's not a ton I can say about hexadecimal other than saying it's really useful to know. In my experience, I don't use hex as often as binary, but considering that signal strength values are literally made to be hex digits, it can be a really useful tool. The last thing I want to show you in this video has to do with the relationship between binary and hex, because it's really cool. You see, since 16 is a power of 2, converting from binary to hex or from hex to binary is really easy. So easy that you don't even need a calculator. Let's say I have this long binary number. I don't even know what the number is, but to convert it to hex, I don't have to. All I have to do is split it into groups of 4 bits starting from the right, like this. Each group of 4 bits is exactly representative of one hex digit. If you look at this first group, we have 0110, which is binary for 6. The middle group, 1111, is 15, or F, and the last group is 4. Therefore, this binary number in hexadecimal is 6F4. And that's it from me about number systems. Like I said, binary and hex are super important for logical redstone. I highly recommend getting comfortable with them. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. Today, we're finally going to build our first redstone circuits. But first, let's talk about the fundamental idea behind every circuit we'll ever make: logic. What is logic? Why is it useful? And how can we implement it with redstone? If you're not already familiar with binary, I highly recommend watching the previous episode. Binary and some hexadecimal will be extremely important for the rest of this series. So without further ado, let's get started. Throughout history, humans have always been eager to quantify logic. Whether it was to question things like morality or to reason about the laws of nature, humans are always trying to gain a deeper, logical understanding of the world around them. As a result, countless systems of logic, math, and science have been developed all over the world. In the mid-1800s, a system was published by a man named George Boole, called Boolean algebra. Nowadays, Boolean algebra is the foundation behind digital logic, as well as many other applications. So, how does it work? Just like normal algebra, Boolean algebra has variables, but instead of taking on any possible value, these variables can only have 2 values, true or false, 1 or 0. Boolean algebra also has operations. Similar to addition or multiplication that you would see in normal algebra, Boolean algebra has logical operations. The 3 most basic ones are AND, OR, and NOT. Let's look at these in more detail. First, we have the NOT operation, also referred to as negation. In Boolean algebra, it's signified with this negation symbol, but in other notations like in programming, you might also see it expressed as an exclamation point. The NOT operation simply outputs the opposite of what it's given. Let's say I have this expression, the negation of A. A is a variable, so I don't know what it is, but I know it's either true or false. So let's make a table to describe both possibilities, as well as what the output would be. We have 2 possibilities for A, and the output in both scenarios is just the opposite of A, because it's being negated. This table is saying that if A is false, not A is true, and if A is true, not A is false. This type of table, where you list all the possibilities, is called a truth table. One interesting property about negation is that if you do it twice, you're back to where you started. This means that the expression not A is equivalent to A. In other words, they will always have the same truth value, no matter if A is true or false. Next, we have the OR operation, also referred to as disjunction. In Boolean algebra, it's signified with a V symbol, or sometimes with what looks like addition. And in programming, it's often expressed with a vertical bar. Let's look at the expression A or B. OR outputs true if A or B is true. A and B are variables, and once again, I don't know what they are. So I'll make a truth table with A, B, and the output A or B. This time, our truth table needs 4 rows, because we have 4 possibilities for A and B. Now, according to the OR operation, we output true when at least one of them is true. By looking at the table, we can see that that corresponds to these 3 rows. The only time that A or B is false is when A and B are both false. And that's the truth table for the OR operation. Finally, we have the AND operation, also referred to as conjunction. It's signified with an upside-down V symbol, or sometimes with what looks like multiplication. And in programming, it's often expressed with the AND symbol. Sorry, I do not have enough resolution here for a good AND symbol. This is terrible. The expression A and B outputs true if both A and B are true. So once again, we can make a truth table with the 4 possibilities for A and B. The only row that outputs true is the one on the bottom, where both A and B are true. The other 3 rows are false. Also, if you didn't notice already, these 3 operations work the same way that they do in conversation. Let's say Bob is a man wearing a blue shirt. If I said the statement, Bob is a man and Bob is wearing a red shirt, you'd say that's false, because even though he's a man, he's not wearing a red shirt, he's wearing a blue one. Both parts of the statement have to be true for the whole thing to be true. But if I said Bob is a man or Bob is wearing a red shirt, you'd say that's true, because Bob is a man. The other parts of the statement don't matter, as long as at least one of them is true. Alright, awesome. So those are the three basic operators of Boolean algebra. And once you have these operators, you can also start to create what are called laws. A law of Boolean algebra is just a small Boolean expression designed to show some property or fact. For example, if I have x or 0, this will always be equal to just x. This is called the identity law. Or if I have x or 1, this will always be equal to 1. Because the OR operator doesn't care what x is, it's going to output true either way. This is called the annihilator law. And lastly, one of the most important laws in all of Boolean algebra is called De Morgan's law. It states that the negation of an AND operator is equivalent to distributing the negation and switching it to an OR operator. And the reverse is true as well. So De Morgan's tells us that you can distribute a negation as long as you swap the operator. This is a really powerful law and it's used all the time. Of course, you can always just prove it with a truth table, and I encourage you to do so, but another way to think about it is like this. If A and B are not both true, then that means either A is false or B is false. There are a bunch of other laws I could go over, but I'll save that for you to look at in the description if you're interested. What I do want to go over though is analyzing a Boolean expression, because now we have the tools to do so. Let's take a look at this Boolean expression. A or B and not C. Our truth table needs 8 rows to cover the 8 possibilities of A, B, and C. And by the way, the number of rows we need is always 2 to the power of how many different variables there are. In this case, 2 to the third is 8. Okay, now let's start to think about when this equation would be true. The first thing I notice is that when A is true, the whole thing is true, right? We know that from the annihilator law. The OR gate doesn't care what this second quantity is. As long as A is true, the whole thing will output true. So let's mark true on all the rows where A is true, which is just these bottom 4 rows, because on these rows, A is 1. Now for the other 4 rows, A is false, but that's not enough to conclude what the OR gate will evaluate to. We still have to look at the second part, because the second part might make the OR gate become true again. So the question is, when is B and not C true? Well, I kind of just said it. It's true when we have B and not C. In other words, when B is true and C is false. And if we look at the 4 remaining rows, there's only one row where that's the case. B is 1, C is 0, so right on this row, we need this to be true. The last 3 rows have to be false, because we've shown that both sides of the OR are false. And that is our finished truth table. Now we know what this expression will evaluate to for any combination of A, B, and C. If you have any doubts about this, or if you're brand new to Boolean algebra, I highly recommend going through each row one at a time, plugging in the truth values, and seeing if the output makes sense. And if you want more practice, try filling out the truth table for these expressions. I'll put the solutions in the description. Alright, awesome. Now, before we start building circuits, I want to talk about one more operation, the exclusive OR, also known as XOR. Even though it's technically not one of the 3 basic operations, it's still extremely useful and used everywhere. Here's the symbol for it. It's like a circle with a plus sign on it. And in programming, it's often expressed with the caret symbol. The way it works is it outputs true if only one of the inputs are true. Here's the truth table for it. It's pretty similar to OR. The only difference is that when both inputs are true, XOR outputs false, because you can't have both. It's exclusive. Okay, now let's finally talk about circuits. To use Boolean algebra to its fullest potential, we should build circuits that mimic these logical operators. These types of circuits are called logic gates. There are 4 logic gates that correspond to the operations I've talked about so far: the NOT gate, the OR gate, the AND gate, and the XOR gate. All of these gates essentially just implement their operation on real binary signals, and they follow the exact same truth table. So let's check out each one and how to build them with Redstone. First, NOT gates. These are represented in logic diagrams with a triangle and a dot on the end of it. They literally just take a binary input, negate it, and give a binary output. And lucky for us, there's a Redstone component that's specifically designed for NOT gates, the Redstone torch. If I have a wire connected to a Redstone torch, the output is the negation of the input. This is a NOT gate. And although this is the most common way to make one, there are plenty of other ways. For example, I can make one with a comparator on subtract mode that's being powered from the back. The input to the NOT gate is the side of the comparator. As you can see, when the side is not being cancelled, the output is 1, but when you cancel the side, the output is 0. Next, let's make an OR gate. Here's the symbol for it in logic diagrams. It takes 2 binary inputs and gives 1 binary output. The funny thing is, with Redstone, OR gates are stupidly easy because they're already built into how Redstone wire behaves. If I take 2 wires and connect them into a single wire, then as long as at least one of the inputs are on, the output is on. So technically, this is an OR gate. Yeah, not very complicated. And just in case you want some other variations, here are some examples. You can play around with them in the world download in the description. Next, let's make an AND gate. This is the symbol for 1, and of course it just outputs 1 when both inputs are 1. Unfortunately in Redstone, there's no super easy way to make an AND gate. It's not built directly into any components. However, if you have NOT gates and OR gates, you can actually construct an AND gate out of them. That being said, this is a perfect opportunity to try to make one yourself. If you don't want to do it in Redstone, you can also just draw it as a logic diagram. As a hint, you need at least 3 NOT gates and 1 OR gate. Pause the video now if you want to try it. Alright, welcome back, and here it is. We have NOT gates on the inputs, then they go into an OR gate, and then 1 more NOT gate on the end. So to check our work, let's build this with Redstone and see if it actually behaves like an AND gate. Okay, here's a super small version of it. These torches pointing up are the first 2 NOT gates, this dust in the middle is the OR gate, and this final torch is the last NOT gate. And as you can see, the output is only on when both inputs are on. Awesome, it's an AND gate. But why exactly does this work? Well, the easiest way to see why it works is literally just by looking at the redstone. This final torch can only turn on if the dust turns off. But the only way for the dust to turn off is for both of these torches to turn off, which you can only do by powering both inputs. Another way to make an AND gate is by using a comparator in subtract mode. All you have to do is put one input in the back and a negated input in the side. This works because the comparator will output a signal only if it has power in the back and it's not being cancelled from the side. Any other combination and you won't get an output. So I guess I kinda lied when I said no component implements it directly. You can fake it pretty well with comparators. Last up, we have the XOR gate. The symbol for it is basically an OR gate with a bar on the back. Just like the AND gate, there's no super easy way to make one with Redstone. But once again, you can make it with just NOTs and ORs, and here's the diagram for it. Now, I would build this, but over the years, people have created some clever designs that don't exactly follow this diagram. The most common design is this one. It uses 2 comparators on subtract mode. As you can see, it will output 1 if only one of the inputs are on. If you input both, it'll output 0. The way this works is by abusing symmetry. If both inputs are on, then both comparators are receiving 14 signal strength in the back and in the side, which means that they're both going to output a 0. But if only one of the inputs are on, then one of the comparators is going to receive less strength in the side than in the back. Notice how this one receives 14 and 14 still, but this one on the right receives 13 and 11. 14 minus 14 is 0, but 13 minus 11 is 2. And when you combine both signals together, the 2 trumps the 0, so we get an output. And this works the other way too because it's symmetrical. The only bad thing about this design is that the output is a very low signal strength, only 2, which basically forces you to use another repeater. So another configuration you could use is this one. This XOR gate has a much higher signal strength on the output. And yeah, I've genuinely never had the need to use any other type of XOR, but just in case you're looking for more designs, there's going to be more in the world download. At this point, you might be wondering, why did I explain all that Boolean algebra stuff if we're just going to be using logic gates at the end of the day? The reason is because as circuits get more complicated, it gets harder to understand what they're doing just by looking at them. Boolean algebra provides a language for you to stop thinking about Redstone and instead think directly about the logic problem you're trying to solve. Also, there are a bunch of Boolean algebra simplifiers online where you can type in an expression and it'll give you an equivalent expression as simplified as possible. That is extremely useful because it can literally show you that you don't need as much redstone. The shorter your expression is, the fewer gates you need to implement it, right? For example, let's say I'm designing a redstone game and I find out I need a circuit to implement this expression. I get really sad because it looks super complicated. But after plugging it into a simplifier, turns out it's equivalent to just A and B. So yeah, that's why I'm going to keep mentioning Boolean algebra throughout this series because it's a really nice tool. Before I end this video, there are 3 more logic gates I want to talk about. And don't worry, they're extremely easy to remember. The logic gates OR, AND, and XOR have negated versions named NOR, NAND, and XNOR. The symbols for them are the same as the original symbols, but with a dot on the end to signify negation. Each of these gates is equivalent to just taking the normal version and putting a NOT gate on the output. For example, this is the OR gate from earlier, and this is a NOR gate. If you want to make a truth table for a NOR gate, just take the OR gate truth table and invert the output column. Change the 1s to 0s and 0s to 1s. Similarly, to make a NAND gate, you can take the AND gate from earlier and put a redstone torch on it like this. Although, if you look at this carefully, we have 2 torches in a row. That's a double negation, which cancels out. So technically you can also just remove a torch instead of adding one. That works too. This is also a NAND gate. And lastly, XNOR. Of course, you can always just slap a torch on the end like we did for the other ones. That's an easy way to do it. But another cool way to make an XNOR is by inverting one of the inputs of XOR. This is kind of unintuitive, and it definitely does not work the same way for NOR and NAND, but it's a cool property that I learned recently. You can prove it to yourself by testing it out, or also by using Boolean algebra. I'll put the Boolean algebra proof on screen right now if you want to take a look at it. I think that's it for NOR, NAND, and XNOR. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. Last episode we talked about Boolean algebra and logic gates. Today we're going to use those logic gates to build a binary adder. Like I said last time, if you haven't learned binary by now, you're really going to want to. There are a ton of resources in the description to do so, including episode 2 of this series. So without further ado, let's get started. First, let's define what the term binary adder means. A binary adder is a circuit that takes 2 binary numbers as input and outputs their sum. For example, if I input 110 or 6 and 100 or 4, 6 plus 4 is 10. 1010. So how do you even approach something like this? Well, I think the first step is to get super comfortable with binary addition on paper. We need to break down exactly what happens when 2 binary numbers get added together. To do that, let's first remind ourselves how to add numbers in decimal. To add 2 numbers together, you add the digits of each column together starting from the right. For example, if I have 43 plus 89, the first thing I do is 3 plus 9, which is 12. So mark a 2 here and carry the 10 to the next digit. Then we do 1 plus 4 plus 8, which is 13. So mark a 3 and carry a 10 to the next digit again. But there are no more digits to add it to, only these invisible zeros. So the carry can be directly written to the answer, giving us a final sum of 132. Okay, easy enough. Now let's apply that same concept to binary addition. Let's do 5 plus 9, 101 plus 1001. Just like decimal, we go column by column, starting from the right. For the first column, we have 1 plus 1, which is 2. But 2 in binary already takes up 2 digits, it's 10. So let's mark a 0 and carry over the 1 to the next column. Remember, the next column is twice as valuable, so this carried 1 is essentially worth 2 instead of 10. Now to add up the next column, we just do 1 plus 0 plus 0, which is 1. Next, 1 plus 0 is also 1. And finally, 0 plus 1 is 1. So 5 plus 9 is 1110, or 14. Let's do one more example. This time I have 7 plus 6. 1 plus 0 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, so mark a 0 and carry. And 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. 3 in binary is 1, 1, so let's mark a 1 and carry. But once again, we're carrying 2 invisible zeros, so we can just write it on the output. So 7 plus 6 is 1101, or 13. Perfect. So that's how binary addition works. As you can see, it's pretty similar to decimal addition. If you want more practice with binary addition, check out this video in the description. It has great walkthroughs of more examples. Now let's make a binary adder. To keep things simple, let's start with the simplest possible adding circuit. A circuit that just takes 2 binary bits, A and B, and outputs a single bit for their sum. We have 4 cases for A and B. The first 3 cases are 0 plus 0 equals 0, 0 plus 1 equals 1, and 1 plus 0 equals 1. In other words, the truth table with A, B, and sum looks like this. Now the 4th case is a special one. 1 plus 1 is 2, but as I showed earlier, this means the output is 0, and we carry over to the next column. So in our truth table, the sum for 1 plus 1 is 0, but that's only part of the story. We need another output bit for the carry. This new carry bit is 1 only when the input is 1 plus 1. Let's also add that output to our little diagram, and now this is the finished truth table for our adder. So to implement this with Redstone, which logic gates are going to be the most useful? Does the output for the carry or for the sum remind you of any logic gates in particular? As it turns out, the carry can be made with an AND gate, and the sum can be made with an XOR gate. The truth tables for these gates match exactly what we want. So let's grab those gates and make this with Redstone. Alright, here it is. As you can see, we have an XOR gate for the sum and an AND gate for the carry, and both inputs are just kind of going into both of them. In digital logic, this circuit is called a half adder. A half adder takes in 2 bits and adds them together, giving a sum and a carry. Just for good measure, let's test out the half adder and make sure it works. 1 plus 0 is 1, 0 plus 1 is also 1, and 1 plus 1 is 2. Perfect. Okay, so now we can add 1 plus 1, but what if we want to add bigger binary numbers together? For that, it's going to get a little more complicated. But I think a good starting place would be to analyze exactly what happens in a column of binary addition. At any individual column, there are essentially 3 bits that you're adding up. The top bit, the bottom bit, and the carry coming in from the previous column if there was one. I'll call these 3 bits A, B, and carry in. For example, on this column, A is 0, B is 0, and the carry in is 1. But on this other column, A is 1, B is 0, and carry in is 0. Once you add up these 3 bits, you essentially produce 2 output bits. The sum, which is part of the final answer, and sometimes a carry going out to the next column. I'll call these output bits the sum and the carry out. So if we could make a circuit that adds 3 bits together and produces a sum and a carry, or, the 2-bit result, we could simulate a column of binary addition. But the question is, how? Well, remember, we have a half adder, and a half adder can add 2 bits together. So if we want to add 3 bits, we can simply do 2 additions. For example, if you have 1 plus 2 plus 3, you're adding 3 numbers, but it's not being done directly. First, you add the 1 to the 2, then you add the result of that to the 3. Notice how you just added 3 numbers using only operations that add 2 numbers at a time. Transposing to circuits, we can have a half adder that adds the first 2 bits, and then have another half adder that adds the sum of that with the 3rd bit, and the final sum is output right here. This nearly works. The only problem with this is that you might get a carry from the first half adder or from the second one, but that can be fixed with a simple OR gate. And now, this circuit is called a full adder. A full adder takes in 3 bits and adds them together, giving a sum and a carry. That's exactly what we need for a column of binary addition. And if you're interested in the truth table for a full adder, here's what that looks like. There are 8 cases for the 3 inputs, A, B, and carry in, and the output is the result of adding the 3 bits together. For example, on this row, we have 1 plus 0 plus 1, so the full adder produces 2, a carry and no sum, which, by the way, corresponds to this case during binary addition. Now, of course, this is not the only way to make a full adder. All that matters in the definition of a full adder is that it matches this truth table. However you want to implement it is up to you, but doing it like this with the 2 half adders makes the most sense to me. But anyways, let's test this out. If we input a single bit, no matter where it is, we should get just a sum. If we put in any combination of 2 bits, we get a carry, and all 3 bits gives a carry and a sum. Beautiful. And of course, if you're making one yourself, I recommend checking all 8 cases before using it. Okay, now using this full adder, we can construct a multi-bit binary adder. To do that, let's reorient the inputs and outputs to look like this. You'll see why in a minute. A and B are on the bottom, the sum is on the top, the carry in is on the right, and the carry out is on the left. Also, now that we know how it behaves, let's transfer to a more compact version to save some space. This is a super small design for a full adder that's been around for a long time. If you want to look at it more closely, the world download is in the description, but it really implements the exact same logic that I've drawn out here. We still have the exact same inputs and outputs, A, B, carry in, carry out, and sum. Now, notice how during addition, the carry out of one column becomes the carry in of the next one. So, to mimic this with Redstone, let's chain full adders together like this, plugging the carry out of each one into the carry in of the next one. And now, this is a binary adder. Specifically, it's a 4-bit binary adder. By using a chain of 4 full adders, we can now add any 2 4-bit binary numbers together. The first input to the adder consists of the 4 A bits, the second input consists of the 4 B bits, and the output is made up of the 4 sum bits. Let's go ahead and try it out. 5 plus 9 gives us 14. Nice. And 7 plus 6 gives us 13. Beautiful. This type of adder is called a ripple carry adder because, as it's calculating, the carries ripple across the adder. Now, because of the nature of these full adders, we still have a dangling carry in on the first one and a carry out on the last one. So what do we do with those? Well, this carry in is representing a carry on the very first column, which of course never happens on paper. But if it did happen, it would just be worth 1, right? I mean, we're just adding another 1 to the first column. For example, if I add 5 plus 9 plus 1, we get 15. If we get a carry out, that means that the final column carried over, in which case it gets written directly on the output. So if you want, you can wire the carry out to be part of the answer. Now if we input large numbers like 11 plus 14, the output is 25, 11001. Notice how the carry out is the 5th bit of the answer. And in general, adding two n-bit numbers produces a number up to n plus 1 bits long. The plus 1 is because of that final carryout. Okay, so we just made a 4-bit ripple carry adder, or RCA for short. Using this technique of chaining full adders together, you can make an adder as big as you want. For example, this is what a 32-bit RCA looks like. I really like RCAs because they're the easiest and most straightforward type of adder to understand. However, they have a fatal flaw that makes them very unlikable in digital logic. As an RCA gets bigger, it takes longer and longer, on average, to produce the answer. The carries have to take more time to propagate across all the full adders. For example, if you add this huge number with just one more 1, yeah, it's gonna take a while. It would be really cool to have a synchronous adder, or an adder that takes the same amount of time to compute no matter what you input. A well-known type of synchronous adder is called a carry look-ahead adder, or CLA. These are used in real electronics as a faster type of adder. A CLA essentially adds more logic in the back of the adder to compute the carries all at once. Of course, that's a big simplification, and if you want to learn more about how CLAs work, check out these videos in the description. They're actually really interesting. However, I'm not going to build a CLA with Redstone. Instead, I'm going to dive into the world of Redstone-specific synchronous adders. You see, over the years, the logical Redstone community has developed some really clever types of adders that abuse the weird quirks of Redstone. These adders are not replicable in real life. They don't actually exist anywhere outside of Minecraft. So let's briefly go over a few of these Redstone-specific adders, and then I'll go over my favorite one in more detail. First, we have the carry look everywhere adder. These adders were really common in the early days of logical Redstone, being first popularized by a YouTuber named Nuomaster. This is an 8-bit carry look everywhere adder, and it has a speed of 4 ticks, meaning that no matter what inputs I give it, the output will always arrive exactly 4 ticks later, completely synchronized. The Redstone mechanic being abused here is glass towers. These glass towers are used to combine carry signals from multiple places at once and to control how far they propagate. I'm not an expert on this type of adder, so I'm not going to go into any more detail, but you can play around with it yourself in the world download. The inputs and outputs are diagonal, which is kind of weird, but let's go ahead and see what it looks like to add 5 plus 3. The 5 goes here, the 3 goes here, and we get 8. 1000. Another type of Redstone-specific adder is called an instant carry adder. These were also really common in the early days. This is an 8-bit instant carry adder made by Q2CK. It has a speed of 4 ticks, and this time the inputs and outputs are horizontal. The Redstone mechanic being abused here is pistons blocking signals. For example, let's say I have a setup like this, where a carry is coming in from the right, and I want to control how far it propagates. If I lift this piston, it instantly travels to the rest of the outputs. But if I want to stop the propagation at a certain point, I can just block it off, stopping it from reaching any future outputs. Again, this is a huge simplification because I'm not an expert on this type of adder either. Once again, let's add the classic 5 plus 3, and we get 8. Okay, so both of these are great, and at one time, these adders, along with a few other types, were pretty common. But in 2015, a revolutionary new type of Redstone adder was invented by magical gentlemen called the Carry Cancel Adder, or CCA. And even today, CCAs are still one of the most common adders to use in logical Redstone. Here's an example of what a CCA might look like. The cool thing about CCAs is that they're vertical, which makes them easier to work with and feel more compact. And they're completely pistonless, unlike the instant carry adder, and that removes any chance of weird timings. As you can see, if I add 7 plus 1, we get an 8 completely synchronized. I use CCAs for everything now, and a lot of people view them as the holy grail of redstone adders. So let's dive into how they work. Just like most fast adders, the first thing a CCA does is it computes all the carries at once. What I mean by that is it calculates all the little numbers that you would write above the columns during an addition problem. For example, let's say I have 5 plus 3. Definitely haven't used these numbers in this video yet. If you go ahead and add these the normal way, then after you're done, you had to carry a 1 3 times. Here, here, and here. Since you didn't carry to any other columns, let's mark those with zeros. So when I say the carries, I'm referring to this top row. Now, like I said, a CCA computes all the carries first, and I'll explain how it does that in just a bit. What's more important to understand here is that if you are somehow magically given these carries, the rest of the addition problem is really fast for a circuit to compute. This is because you don't have to start at the rightmost column anymore. If you're already given the carries, you can calculate the sum for every column all at once. In other words, the problem is parallelizable. There's no more dependencies between the columns. If we go back to the full adder and look at how the sum is calculated, we can see that it's calculated by taking A XOR B XOR C, which is the same thing as just adding 3 bits together and only looking at the rightmost bit. Therefore, if we apply A XOR B XOR C to each column, we get our final answer. We didn't even have to think about carrying or anything. The carries were already given. For example, in this first column, we have 0 XOR 1 XOR 1, which is 0. So clearly, if you want to make a fast adder, all of your energy should be devoted to just figuring out what those carries are. And that's really what these redstone-specific adders work so hard to do. They all use some special trick to generate the carries. Alright, so how exactly does a CCA figure out those carries? A CCA generates the carries by a process called carry cancel. That's why it's in the name. Let me show you how that process works. Let's say we want to generate the carries for 5 plus 3. Anytime you see a column with 2 1s, you know for sure that it's going to create a carry. So, create a signal of 1s going to the left forever, called a carry signal. Then, anytime you see a column with 2 0s, you know that the carry will not be able to continue. So, create a signal of 0s going to the left forever, called the cancel signal, which trumps any previous carry signals. Now, if you get another carry signal later, it creates 1s again, because carries have priority over previous cancel signals. But of course, eventually, you'll hit another 0 0, which, once again, cancels it forever. After this process, you're left with a string of 1s and 0s. Amazingly, this string is the carries. It's just shifted over by 1. So, yeah, that's how a CCA works. It runs the carry cancel process to generate all the carries, and then computes A XOR B XOR C on each column at the same time to get the sums. Pretty cool, right? At this point, if you want to just download the world and use the CCA, feel free. I totally respect that. But for the people that want a greater understanding, let's go over how all the redstone of a CCA works. It's actually really clever. First, the carry cancel process. This is done using 2 glass towers with comparators on subtract mode. The tower in the back is for the carry signals, and the one in the side is for the cancel signals. As you can see, if we get a carry signal, it travels up forever, but not down, because that's how glass towers work. Since this is a vertical adder, that's the same thing as traveling left, but not right, on paper. And if we get a cancel signal later on, it cancels it forever. This is because at every layer, the side has a higher signal strength than the back, which means all the comparators on subtract mode will output 0. Then, if we get another carry signal later, it's able to generate again because all the signal strengths are higher than the cancel below it. But if you get another cancel, of course, it cancels it forever. One thing to note here is that this only works for up to 8 bits. Beyond that, the signal strength might run out, and this thing doesn't work anymore. In fact, most redstone-specific adders are only 8 bits for similar reasoning. It all comes down to signal strength. But anyways, this is really cool. By putting in the carry signals here and the cancel signals here, we can generate all the carries of the addition problem at the same time. And it only takes 1 tick to calculate, because all these comparators are working in parallel. That's why it's so fast. The next part of a CCA is these 2 input towers, A and B, and an XOR gate at every single layer. Now remember, we want a carry signal when both bits are 1 and a cancel signal when both bits are 0. For the cancel signal, we can implement it with a torch like this. This torch will only be on if both bits are 0. In other words, it's a NOR gate. Then for the carry signal, since we're detecting both bits being 1, ideally we would implement that with an AND gate. Instead though, I'm going to do something a little weird. I'm going to invert the output of this XOR to make it an XNOR instead, and use that for the carry. This is almost an AND gate, except for when both bits are 0. But when both bits are 0, we get a cancel signal anyways, so it doesn't actually matter. We're good. Okay, perfect. Real quick, let's try generating the carries. If we input 5 plus 3, the carry signals are 1, 1, 1. That is perfect. The last thing to do is, for each bit, compute A XOR B XOR C. We already have an XOR gate in the back, so we can just grab A XOR B from right here. Then, let's make another XOR gate to XOR that with the corresponding carry. And that is the finished CCA adder. You can probably see why people like them so much now. They're just elegant. Oh, and by the way, just like most adders, CCAs have a carry in and a carry out. The carry in is all the way down here. It's powering the very bottom of the carry tower. And the carry out is right here. It's the highest output of the carry tower. This also means that if you want to have a CCA with more than 8 bits, you technically can. All you have to do is stack 2 8-bit modules on top of each other and connect the carry out to the next carry in. You're going to lose some speed though, and the synchronization gets all weird, so honestly, I don't recommend this unless you really know what you're doing. 8 bits is absolutely plenty for 99% of Redstone applications, but it's cool that it's an option. Because of the way I built this CCA, the speed is 5 ticks, and that's plenty fast enough for me in most cases. However, just because I think it's interesting, I want to show you just how crazy optimized CCAs have become recently. This is a CCA made by my friend Don, and it's only 3 ticks. That might not seem very different from 5, but when you're using an adder over and over and over again, the time save is huge. I'm not even going to pretend to understand how this works. All I know is that a lot of really smart engineering went into making this. And here's another 3-tick CCA made by my friend Fearless. This one is special because not only is it pistonless like the other ones, it's also torchless. This has the advantage that you never have to worry about torches burning out if you're computing many additions in succession, which is attractive for something like a computer where you really want it to be 100% reliable. And finally, this is a hexadecimal CCA made by Yellow Bunny. The inputs are 2 4-digit hexadecimal numbers using signal strength, and the output is a 5-digit hex number also shown in signal strength. Great job guys, you should be proud of these, and thanks for letting me show them off. With that, I think I've covered pretty much all I know about Redstone Addition. Dude, it doesn't even fit in render distance anymore. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. Last episode, I covered binary addition and showed off some really cool redstone adders. Today, we're going to take it one step further and talk about subtraction. I hope you enjoy. Just like last time with addition, binary subtraction is really similar to decimal subtraction. You can subtract binary numbers on paper using a pretty simple algorithm, and if you want, you can make a circuit that directly implements that algorithm just like the full adder. However, I wouldn't recommend doing that. You see, subtraction can actually be viewed as just another form of addition, as long as you consider both positive and negative numbers. For example, if I want to subtract 6 minus 4, this is equivalent to 6 plus negative 4. They both equal 2. In general, a minus b is the same thing as a plus negative b. Notice how this isn't a subtraction. It's an addition between a positive number and a negative number. Therefore, if we could somehow represent negative numbers in binary, then maybe we could just reuse an adder to simulate subtraction. So let's try to represent negative numbers in binary. In math, negative numbers are written with a negative sign in the front, and although not as common, positive numbers can have a plus sign. That sign is one extra bit of information, right? It has 2 states, and the state of it tells you the sign of the number. So why not just copy that strategy in binary? Let's make the first bit of a number the sign bit. 0 means positive, and 1 means negative. And the rest of the binary number will have the normal place values. This format is called signed magnitude notation, because the number consists of a sign and a magnitude. The sign is the first bit, and the magnitude is the rest of the number. For example, let's say I have 1101 in sign magnitude notation. The sign bit is 1, so it's negative, and the magnitude is 101, or 5. So 1101 in this notation is negative 5. Or let's say I have 0111. The sign is 0 and the magnitude is 7, so this is positive 7. One important thing about this format is that you need to know how many bits you're working with. 1101 is only -5 if you're working with 4 bits. If you were working with 5 bits, this could be interpreted as positive 13. Or if you were working with 3 bits, it could be -1. But anyways, this is a pretty solid way to represent negative numbers. It's simple, and it's kind of what we're already used to when we read numbers. And here's a table that shows all the different 4-bit numbers and what each one represents in sign magnitude notation. One weird thing about this is that we have 2 representations for 0, both positive 0 and negative 0, but oh well, maybe it doesn't matter. What matters more is, does this format work if you add positive and negative numbers together? Because that's our ultimate goal. Well, let's try it out. I've got a 4-bit CCA here. If we add positive 5 plus negative 5, we get this. Remember, we need to stay in 4 bits here, so let's just ignore the carryout. And it looks like we got positive 2. That's not great. We wanted a 0, not a 2. Clearly, adding positives and negatives together with sign magnitude does not always work. So back to the drawing board, I guess. Alright, well, even though this answer was not what we wanted, I want you to notice something interesting that happened during that addition. We added 2 numbers together, and the result got so big that it couldn't fit in the same number of bits anymore. We got a carryout, and in a way, our adder overflowed. This idea of overflowing an adder is actually the key behind simulating subtraction with addition. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say I'm working with 4 bits and I want to subtract 6 minus 2. Now, 6 minus 2 is 4, but again, we're trying to simulate this using addition. So the question is, can we add something to 6 that has the same effect as subtracting 2? As it turns out, you can. If you add 14 instead, then 6 plus 14 is 20, but notice that it overflowed. So we ignore the 16-bit, and the answer is 4. Therefore, adding 14 has the same effect as subtracting 2, as long as you stay in 4 bits. Okay, so let's just say that 14, or 1110, is the representation for -2. And now you can even test this on the CCA. 6 plus -2 is 4. This representation for -2 is basically so big that it overflowed the adder and wrapped around to give the correct answer again. A really good analogy for this is a clock. On a 12-hour clock, instead of going 2 hours backwards, you can also go 10 hours forwards. Both of those get you to the same time. Also, if you go past 12, like maybe 13 o'clock, that's the same thing as 1 o'clock. This is called modular arithmetic. You could say that a 12-hour clock has a modulus of 12. And in mathematics, you can express this by saying 13 equals 1 mod 12. Because 13 and 1 are both 1 past a multiple of 12. And since 2 hours backwards is the same as 10 forwards, you can also say that -2 equals 10 mod 12. Now, since we're working with only 4 bits, this is the same thing as mod 16, or a 16-hour clock if you want to look at it that way. Remember how 20 was the same thing as 4? Well, that's because 20 is 4 past a multiple of 16. 20 equals 4 mod 16. So, to find a good representation for a negative number, all you have to do is find an equivalent positive number in that modulus. In mod 16, -2 is equal to positive 14. That's why 14 works really well as a representation for -2 when you're working with 4 bits. And by the way, a little shortcut to find it is to just take the modulus minus that number. 16 minus 2 is 14. Therefore, 14 must be a good representation for -2. As another example, let's say I wanted to do 7 minus 3, and I'm working with 5 bits. Working with 5 bits is the same thing as mod 32. In general, working with n bits is the same thing as mod 2 to the n. So we can find a good representation for -3 by doing 32 minus 3, which is 29. And sure enough, if you add 7 plus 29, or 7 plus -3, and ignore the overflow, you get 4. Perfect. Alright, we're making great progress. Let's design a notation for negative numbers based on this new knowledge. I'll make the positive numbers the same thing that they were in signed magnitude. No reason to change those. But then for the negative numbers, I'll make them all 16 minus the positive version, because 16 is the modulus for 4 bits. For example, 16 minus 5 is 11, so the representation for -5 is 11, or 1011. This notation has a special name. It's called 2's complement. 2's complement is the most popular notation for negative numbers in computers, and for good reason. It has a ton of advantages. The first and most important advantage is that it allows us to reuse adders to perform subtraction. For example, let's do 5 plus -4. According to the table, 5 is 0101 and -4 is 1100. And we get 1. Beautiful. The other advantage is that it's really easy to go from a number to its negative version, or its complement. To take the complement of a number, all you have to do is invert all the bits and add 1. For example, let's go from +3 to its complement -3. In 4-bit 2's complement, +3 is 0011, inverting all the bits gives us 1100, and then adding 1 gives us 1101. So -3 is 1101. And sure enough, if we invert all the bits and add 1 again, we're back to +3. That makes sense because the complement of a complement cancels out. Also, what's kind of cool is 0 is its own complement. If you take the complement of 0, you just get 0 back. Inverting gives you all 1s, and adding 1 rolls over to 0 again. Now, this invert and add 1 trick can feel very magical, and honestly, you can go your entire career without understanding why it works, and you'll probably be just fine. But I like understanding why things work, so let me show you why inverting and adding 1 actually works. Remember that we got the negative version of a number by taking the modulus minus that number. And because we're in binary, the modulus is always some 2 to the n, like 16 for example. Now if I have 16 minus x, this is the same thing algebraically as 15 minus x plus 1. 15 in binary is all 1s, so 15 minus x has the same effect as inverting x. 1 minus 0 flips the 0 to a 1, 1 minus 1 flips the 1 to a 0. And then of course you can just add 1. Therefore, any 2 to the n minus x is equivalent to inverting the bits of x and adding 1. With this in mind, we can now make a binary subtractor. Let's modify this adder to make it do a plus -b instead of a plus b. I'll invert all the bits of b by adding a bunch of torches, or NOT gates. And then I'll add 1 by turning on the carry in. And now if we put in 7 minus 3, we get 4. Or 2 minus 5 is 1101. That is -3. By inverting the b input and adding 1 with the carry in, this adder is now a subtractor. It computes a plus -b instead of a plus b. And another amazing property of 2's complement is that we still have a sign bit. Notice how the positive numbers start with 0 and the negative numbers start with 1. So that's pretty useful. Okay, so this subtractor is great, but it can kind of only do subtraction. What if we still want to add sometimes as well? Is it possible to modify this in such a way that it could toggle between addition and subtraction? Well, yeah. I mean, in that case, you would need a circuit that just allows you to toggle between inverting b and adding 1 to not doing that anymore. One way to toggle the inversion of b is to use XOR gates. An XOR gate can also be used as a conditional inverter. If you imagine that there's a wire going from this lamp to this lamp, then the other input controls whether or not the wire acts like an inverter. For example, if this is 0, then there's no inversion. The signal just goes through the wire as normal, just like a normal wire would. But if you set the control to 1, now there's an inversion. 0 becomes 1, and 1 becomes 0, just like a redstone torch. So if you stack a bunch of XOR gates on top of each other and OR all of the control signals together into a tower, you can now conditionally invert a binary number. When the control is 0, the number just passes through normally. When the control is 1, the number becomes inverted. So if we add that to the B input, we can now conditionally invert B. And then to add 1, let's just hook up the control signal to the carry in as well. And now when this lever is on, it's a subtractor. The B input becomes negated, and we add 1 using the carry in. But when the lever is off, it's back to being a completely normal adder. For example, let's put in 5 and 2. When the lever is off, it's computing 5 plus 2, which gives us 7. When the lever is on, it's computing 5 minus 2, which gives us 3. That is beautiful. One really important thing I want to stress here is that notations only exist for the developer. The hardware, like an adder, does not know whether or not you're using signed numbers, like 2's complement, or unsigned numbers like the normal binary we used last episode. An adder is just a logic circuit, and it will do what it's told. It's up to you to keep track of what notation you're using and how to interpret the results. Additionally, if you're not careful, it's possible to land way outside the range of 2's complement. I mean, the range of 4-bit 2's complement is only -8 to +7. That's all you can represent. So if you try to do something like -7 plus -7, which is -14, that's way outside your range, and the answer you end up getting will obviously be incorrect. This type of error can be detected with proper circuitry, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. Check out the links in the description if you want to learn more about overflow detection in 2's complement. But anyways, this is really cool. By using a tower of conditional inverters, we can essentially switch between an adder and a subtractor. Another really cool thing about 2's complement is something that I actually didn't know about until the comments in my last series pointed it out. The sign bit of a 2's complement number can be viewed as having a negative place value. For example, 1101 can be thought of as -8 plus 4 plus 1. That equals -3, and sure enough, 1101 is -3. This works for any 2's complement number, positive or negative, and any bit size as well. If I was working with 8-bit 2's complement, then the sign bit would be the -128th place. Real quick, the last thing I want to mention in this video is another notation for negative numbers called 1's complement. Historically, this was used in computers before 2's complement became more popular. It's very similar to 2's complement. The difference is that instead of inverting and adding 1 to take the complement, you only invert. However, due to its long list of disadvantages, it's rarely used in computers anymore, only in rare scenarios. But it's a good thing to know about because it'll still come up from time to time if you go into computer science. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. Last episode we talked about negative numbers and subtraction. Today I have a really cool episode for you. As circuits get larger and more complicated, many common patterns and functionalities arise. So in this episode, we're going to build up what I like to call a toolbox of common logic devices for you to use in your circuits. I hope you enjoy. But first, a bit of terminology. All the logic devices in this video are called combinational. A combinational circuit is independent of time. There's no memory, there are no internal states. A combinational circuit is simply a function from input combinations to outputs. In other words, if you know what the input is, you know what the output is. For example, a full adder is combinational. It has 3 inputs, 2 outputs, and every combination is defined by a truth table. If I input 1, 1, 1, I already know what the output will be without even looking at it. It has to be 1, 1. The other type of circuit we'll learn about later is called a sequential circuit, but more on those later. For now, let's just focus on combinational logic devices. So far in this series, we've already made a few of these devices. We've made logic gates, a half adder, a full adder, an 8-bit adder, and an 8-bit subtractor. The next combinational device I want to show you is called a magnitude comparator. This has nothing to do with the Redstone comparator, that's a completely different thing. In this context, the entire circuit is called the comparator. A magnitude comparator takes in 2 numbers, A and B, and outputs 3 bits of information, whether A is greater than B, equal to B, or less than B. This circuit is really useful because comparing numbers is a very common thing to do. So how should we approach building this? Well, let's start with the equality check. To see if 2 binary numbers are equal to each other, you can simply check each pair of bits and make sure they all match. The easiest way to do that with Redstone is a tower of XOR gates with the outputs ORed into a glass tower and a final NOT gate on the end. Notice that an XOR gate outputs 0 if the bits match and a 1 otherwise. So if all the bits match, then every single XOR gate will output 0, which allows the torch to turn on. But if we get a mismatch on any layer, that XOR gate will output 1, causing the torch to turn off no matter where the signal came from. Alright, perfect. We have an equality checker. Next, let's focus on A greater than B. To check if A is greater than B, we can follow a relatively simple algorithm. First, check the highest bit. If A has a 1 and B has a 0, A must be greater than B no matter what's below. So we can output 1 and we're done. But if A has a 0 and B has a 1, the opposite is true. There's no way A is greater than B, so we can output 0 and be done. And if the highest bits are equal to each other, we don't know which one is bigger yet. So we go down to the next highest pair and run the same checks again. And yeah, if you repeat this process, potentially going down to the lowest bit, you'll eventually figure out whether A is greater than B. Now, the cool thing about building this with Redstone is that we don't have to stick by that logic exactly. There's actually a way to do the same thing using some Redstone-specific properties. This is an A greater than B circuit made by my friends eCanDo and Sloime. It's pretty clever. It uses a modified version of the carry-cancel process from the addition episode, but repurposed for comparisons. As you can see, if I input 10 versus 8, 10 is greater than 8, so we get an output. But if I input 6 versus 8, 6 is not greater than 8, so the output is 0. Also, I kinda lied. This device has an output for equality check as well. If you put a redstone torch right here, this lamp will tell you whether A is equal to B. So we actually don't need our own equality checker. This circuit outputs both A greater than B and A equal to B. Plus, it only takes 3 ticks, which is really cool. Notice that the equality lamp is on right now, and that makes sense. The input is 0 and 0, so A is not greater than B, but A is equal to B. So, now that we have these two outputs, the only thing left for our comparator is A less than B. And the cool thing is, we don't have to make another circuit for this. We can actually derive it just by looking at the other 2 bits. If A is not greater than B, and A is not equal to B, well, the only other option is that it's less than B. Therefore, I'll just put them into a NOR gate, and now we have the output for A less than B. And that is the finished magnitude comparator. We can now input anything for A and B and get the 3 output bits of comparison. Now, I should mention that you can also do this with a subtractor. If you subtract A minus B and the output is 0, well, then you know that A equals B. Or if the output is greater than 0, you know that A is greater than B. In fact, that's the more common way to do it in computers, but I'm not building a computer here. Doing it this way still has its advantages, like being smaller and faster than a subtractor. The next logic device I want to show you is an encoder. An encoder is a device that accepts one input at a time and outputs an encoding for that input. For example, this encoder has 4 potential inputs, A, B, C, and D, and outputs a 3-bit encoding. But in general, you can have as many inputs as you want, and the size of the encoding is up to you as well. Now, you can encode the inputs however you want. It depends on what you want to use the encoder for. In our case, let's just make the encodings for A, B, C, and D 1, 2, 3, and 4 respectively. But I could have chosen anything here. If I input A, the output should be the encoding for A, which is 0, 0, 1. Or if I input C, the output should be the encoding for C, which is 0, 1, 1. So let's build this encoder for real. First, I'll start with 4 lines for A, B, C, and D with a torch on each one to make them inverted. Then underneath, I'll have 3 output wires going this way. Then to make the encodings, we can put torches on the sides of these lines such that they're above the output lines underneath. A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and D is 4. And that is the finished encoder. You can now input A, B, C, or D and get the encoding for it. For example, if I input D, we get D's encoding, which is 1, 0, 0. And by changing the positions of these torches, you can make the encodings whatever you want. Of course, there are way more designs for an encoder as well. The classic design I just showed you goes from horizontal to horizontal, but here's an encoder that goes from horizontal to vertical instead. Each input powers a glass tower, and you can make the encodings using these repeaters. And here's another design. It's pretty similar to the classic one. All I did here was add another layer on top so that the inputs and outputs are perfectly aligned. And finally, here's a design that goes from vertical to vertical using spirals. In case you didn't know, 2x2 spirals are a great way to send data both up and down from anywhere on a wire. And they're stackable directly next to each other, as long as you orient them correctly. So that's the strategy being used here. Of course, if you want to take a closer look at any of these designs or try them out yourself, the world download is in the description. Now, because only one input is supposed to be on at a time, encoders can give you weird behavior if something accidentally breaks that rule. So if you want to enforce that rule on a hardware level, you can attach a circuit like this to the front of an encoder. This circuit will guarantee that only one input is allowed. If multiple inputs are on, it'll just pick the rightmost one. And by the way, an encoder with this circuit on the front has a special name. It's called a priority encoder. Next, let's talk about the opposite of an encoder, a decoder. As you can see by this table, the inputs and outputs are swapped. A decoder takes an encoding and outputs the corresponding signal. For example, if you input the code for C, which is 011, then the output for C should come on. Just like an encoder, a decoder is extremely customizable, depending on what you're using it for. But let's go ahead and build the decoder that matches this table. The key to making a decoder is to understand how to detect a certain binary sequence, because that's what a decoder is all about. The A output is detecting A's sequence, the B output is detecting B's sequence, etc. So as an example, let's say I want to detect the sequence 101. In other words, when these lamps are 101, the output is on. In any other scenario, the output is off. Your first instinct might be to make an AND gate on the first and third bit, and that's a great idea. Let's do that. Okay, I put NOT gates on the input and ORed them into another NOT gate. Now if I turn on the first and third bit, the lamp is on. But the problem is, if you turn on the second bit, the lamp is still on, even though this is not the correct sequence anymore. So let's put a repeater here to force the final torch to be off when the second bit is on. And now this is the detection circuit for 101. The output will be on if and only if the input is 101. In general, if you want to detect a specific sequence, this is the way to do it. Simply put torches on the correct bits, repeaters on the incorrect bits, and OR them all into a final torch. For example, to detect 1100, just go torch, torch, repeater, repeater, and there you go. This circuit will output 1 if and only if the input is 1100. Anything else will not work. So, back to our decoder, let's use this strategy. I'll start by having the input lines vertical like this. Then for each output, let's have a glass tower going into a torch. Then let's place the torches. A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and D is 4. And then put repeaters everywhere else. And just like that, we have a decoder. If I input 3, I get C. Or if I input 4, we get D. Notice how each glass tower is essentially the exact same circuit that we were doing over here. Torches for the ones, repeaters for the zeros, and then all ORed into a final torch. This allows each glass tower to detect a specific sequence. Pretty cool, right? Honestly, as far as designs go, this is pretty much the only one I use. If you download the computer I made recently, you'll notice that literally every decoder I made was in this style. It's just the best design. I don't call things the best design very often, but I will for this one. I mean, you can power the input lines from either end, or even in the back if you want, and you can decode on both sides as well. But of course, there are a lot of other designs, so let's take a look at a few of them. Here's a similar design that uses spirals instead of glass towers. This allows you to go from vertical to vertical in a decently nice way. And here's a design that goes from horizontal to horizontal. Whenever there's a torch, you just put it on the side of the block, and whenever there's a repeater, you just kind of use this formation to power the line underneath. I will warn you though, this design can be really annoying. For example, if you want to have a lot of repeaters in a row, then there might not be enough space for this formation. You'll just have to get creative with how you power the output lines underneath. However, if you give the output lines a 2 wide gap instead of a 1 wide gap, you won't have any of those problems. This design right here is always nice and pretty no matter what your decodings are, because there's plenty of space. Alright, before moving on to the next combinational device, let's look at some cool things you can do with encoders and decoders. First, you can use them to transfer data in less space. With this setup, if I turn on a specific lamp, the corresponding lamp shows up over here, which is really cool when you realize that there's only 3 wires between them. What I'm doing here is encoding each input into a 3-bit number and then decoding it back out. Of course, this doesn't work with multiple inputs at the same time because you can't encode 2 things at once, but it's still pretty neat. Another cool thing is that with encoders and decoders, you can essentially implement any function you want using a kind of brute force type of approach. For example, let's say I want to make something that takes a 4-bit number and simply adds 1 to it. 4 bits gives us 16 possibilities for the input, so first, let's decode for every single possibility using a decoder. Then, once we know which scenario we're in, we can use an encoder to customize what the output should be. Since our goal with this circuit was to add 1, I just encoded it so that it does that. And now, this is our +1 function. If I input 5, then the 5 gets detected right here, and it just gets encoded into a 6 because that's how I programmed it. Or if I input 3, the 3 line gets detected and it gets encoded into a 4. In a way, this circuit is not even really adding 1. I mean, functionally it is, but there's no adder here. Instead, we just decoded for every possible scenario and programmed the output in every single case. That's why I call this the brute force approach. But of course, this approach has a downside. It gets way bigger with more bits. If you wanted to brute force a function from 8 bits to 8 bits, then you would need a 256-line decoder and a 256-line encoder. So yeah, try to use logic gates and Boolean algebra first. The next combinational device is called a multiplexer. Don't be scared by the crazy name, it's actually incredibly simple. A multiplexer, or a mux, is basically a selector. It allows you to select which input you want to allow through. Here's an example of a mux. We have 2 inputs, 1 output, and 1 selector bit. When the selector bit is 0, the left input is allowed through, but the right one isn't. When the selector bit is 1, it's the opposite. The right one is allowed through, but the left one is not. Of course, canceling comparators is not a thing in real life, so in logic diagrams, you might see a mux implemented like this using AND gates. I recommend pausing the video and imagining yourself using this circuit to understand why it works. But yeah, in Minecraft, I always just use comparators for muxes. Also, multiplexers can have as many inputs as you want. This right here is a mux that lets you select from 4 different inputs. Notice that there are now 2 selector bits instead of 1. This is because you need 2 bits to describe 4 possible selections. This decoder underneath simply decodes for those 4 possibilities and unlocks the corresponding input. 0, 0 unlocks the first one. 0, 1 unlocks the second one. 1, 0 unlocks the third one. And 1, 1 unlocks the fourth one. Beautiful. Next, we have the opposite of a mux, a demux. A demux has 1 input, and it allows you to route it to one of the outputs using the selection bits. I tend to think of demuxes like a train track where you can choose where the tracks are going. Here's a small demux. It looks extremely similar to the mux. When the selection is 0, it gets routed to the left, otherwise, it gets routed to the right. And of course, demuxes can have as many outputs as you want using the same decoder technique I showed with the mux. Finally, let's talk about some combinational devices that use signal strength, or hexadecimal. This device is called a red coder. It takes in a signal strength value and it lights up the corresponding lamp. Inputting 7 will light up the 7th lamp, or inputting 15 will light up the 15th lamp. The way this works is actually really clever. First, it splits your input into 2 lines, where the top line has 1 less strength than the bottom. For example, if I input a 6, the bottom line starts with 6 and decays, but the top line starts with 5 and decays. Notice that when you do this, the 6th column is special. It's the only one where the bottom line is powered, but the top one isn't. And this works for any number. If you input a 3, now the 3rd column is the one that's special. So really, all a red coder does is detect that special column, and depending on the design, it might detect it in a few different ways. To me, the most obvious way to detect it would be with XOR gates on every column. If you did that, then these columns and these columns would all output 0, but the special column would output 1. Oh, and red coders can be vertical as well. Here's a super small vertical design. I actually used this in my Flappy Bird game to show the bird. And while we're on the topic of hexadecimal, here's a converter from hex to binary and from binary to hex. I've actually covered these in a previous video, so check that out if you're interested in more detail. But in summary, this one takes a hex number and outputs the binary equivalent, while this one takes a binary number and outputs the hex equivalent. And both of these designs only take 2 ticks, which is honestly really cool. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. Last episode we covered a bunch of combinational logic devices. Today we're going to talk about some smaller circuits that I think you'll find really useful. I hope you enjoy. So far in this series, whenever I showed a circuit, I've only cared about what the values of the input and output are. I never really focused on the length or timing of redstone pulses. But today, that changes. Let's get more comfortable with redstone pulses and how to use them. Remember from episode 1 that Minecraft runs on a tick system, and there are 10 redstone ticks per second. Therefore, each tick is a 1/10 of a second, which we can use as a unit of time. For example, a stone button stays on for exactly 1 second, but you could also say that it stays on for 10 ticks. Because of this, a stone button is essentially a 10-tick pulse generator. Any redstone connected to a stone button will receive a 10-tick pulse when the button is pressed. And a wooden button is a 15-tick pulse generator, activating redstone around it for 1.5 seconds. Now, if you want to generate a shorter pulse, my favorite way to do it is with a comparator. For example, this is a 2-tick pulse generator. When I press this button, the comparator receives a signal, but 2 ticks later, it gets cancelled, giving us a nice 2-tick pulse. The delay between the initial signal and the cancellation is the length of the pulse that gets generated. If I make the delay 4 ticks instead, it becomes a 4-tick pulse generator. And by the way, a little trick to prove to yourself that this is indeed a 4-tick pulse is to put it into a line of repeaters and freeze the game. As you can see, the pulse is exactly 4 repeaters long. Or if you don't have carpet mod, you can also lock the repeaters. The one downside to this design is that you can't use it to generate a 1-tick pulse. It simply won't give an output. The reason gets pretty technical, but it's basically because of how comparators update themselves. In my opinion though, you shouldn't be using 1-tick pulses anyways because they tend to cause issues. But if you absolutely need a 1-tick pulse, the easiest way to do it is with observers. Observers output a 1-tick pulse whenever they receive a block update in the back. But anyways, whenever I make pulse generators, this comparator setup is my go-to. Of course, there are still many different designs as well, especially using observers, pistons, and droppers. And I'll leave those in the world download if you're interested. Now, keep in mind that this strategy will only allow you to generate a pulse shorter than the button pulse, because that's kind of what these circuits are doing. They're shortening the pulse from a button. If you want to generate a pulse longer than the button, you need to lengthen it instead of shortening it. For example, let's take this 10-tick button pulse and extend it to last for 3 more ticks. I'll put another dust here, a 3-tick repeater, and a block so that the signal powers the main line. And now, when I press this button, we get a 13-tick pulse. A great way to visualize what's happening here is with a diagram. The original button pulse lasts for 10 ticks, so if each block represents 1 tick of time, then that's 10 blocks of wool. Now, because of this repeater, we're essentially generating another 10-tick pulse 3 ticks later, which looks like this on the diagram. And if you OR these together, you'll notice that we're getting a consistent signal from at least one of them for the first 13 ticks. So that's why this circuit works as a 13-tick pulse generator. While we're on the subject of pulse extension, there's an interesting property of repeaters that I should probably mention in this video. If a repeater receives a pulse shorter than its delay length, it will extend it up to that length. For example, here I have a 2-tick pulse generator immediately going into a 3-tick repeater. You would expect the 2-tick pulse to just go through the repeater and come out 3 ticks later, but that's not exactly what happens. Yes, it does come out 3 ticks later, but it also gets extended to a 3-tick pulse. This extension will happen anytime a repeater receives a pulse that is shorter than its delay setting. We saw it happen here because 2 is less than 3. As another quick example, if you give a 1-tick pulse to a 4-tick repeater, it'll output a 4-tick pulse because 1 is less than 4. Next, let's talk about clocks. A clock is just a circuit that outputs a signal on a regular basis. The easiest way to make a clock is to just create a redstone loop and put a pulse inside of it. For example, this clock outputs a signal every 5 ticks. The loop is 5 ticks long, so every time the pulse completes a cycle, another 5 ticks have passed. And by changing how many ticks are in the loop, you can change how long the clock cycle is. Also, when clocks are brought up in discussions, you'll often hear the terms period and frequency. The period is just the length of the clock cycle, the time from one output to the next. So this clock has a 5-tick period, or 0.5 seconds. And the frequency is how frequent those cycles are with respect to time. Since every cycle takes half a second, there are 2 cycles per second. Therefore, the frequency is 2 Hz. Hertz literally means cycles per second. Additionally, period and frequency have an inverse relationship. If you take 1 divided by the period, you get the frequency. Or if you take 1 divided by the frequency, you get the period. Now, this type of clock is great, but it can be kind of annoying to start it and stop it. To start it, you have to hook up a pulse generator to it, and to stop it, you have to somehow kill the pulse, perhaps by canceling a comparator or by using a piston to break the loop. But there's another design for a clock that is much easier to start and stop. And it looks like this. Simply take a comparator on subtract mode and route it back into its own side. When you power the comparator from the back, the clock starts. And if you stop powering it, the clock stops. Unlike the previous design, this new type of clock produces a perfect alternating signal. For example, this clock's loop has a total of 5 ticks, 1 for the comparator plus 4 for the repeater. So the signal coming out of it is alternating every 5 ticks. 5 ticks on, 5 ticks off, 5 ticks on, 5 ticks off. And this means that the period of this clock is actually 10 ticks, because it's producing a 5-tick pulse every 10 ticks. Alright, as a final challenge, just to kinda sum everything up, let's create a clock that has, a 16-tick period and outputs a 3-tick pulse. I'll start with a comparator and add 7 more ticks to the loop before canceling it. So this clock will give an 8-tick pulse every 16 ticks. To make it a 3-tick pulse instead, we can just add another comparator, which gets cancelled 3 ticks later. And there we go. This is exactly what we want. A clock with a 16-tick period that outputs a 3-tick pulse. And best of all, we can easily turn it on and off with this lever in the back. Beautiful. Alright, for the rest of this video, let's talk about latches and flip-flops. Latches and flip-flops are basically small, useful circuits that use memory to their advantage. But how can a circuit have memory? What does that even mean? Well, take a look at this circuit. We have an OR gate with the output looping back to one of the inputs. If I power the input, then it will stay on forever, even if I stop powering it. In a way, this lamp being on is the circuit remembering what I did. The problem is, it can't forget it. There's no way to switch this back to 0 unless I manually break the circuit. So consider this circuit instead. This time we have two torches in a chain with the output of the second one looping back into the first one. If we force the first torch to be off, then the second torch turns on, giving us a permanent output. And if we force the second torch to be off, then the first torch turns on, and it switches back to how it was before with the lamp permanently off. This is called a set-reset latch, or an SR latch, because you can set the lamp to be on, or you can reset it to be off. Now, me personally, I find SR latches easiest to think about if you view them as two NOT gates with someone hijacking the signal. But technically, that's not how it works. These torches are actually NOR gates. In fact, if you make a big SR latch like this, it's much easier to see why it's made with two NORs. The set signal and the output are clearly NORed and put into a second NOR with the reset signal. And as you can see, it's the same circuit. I can set it and I can reset it. One cool thing about SR latches is that you can get the inverse of the output for free. Notice that the first NOR always outputs the opposite of the second one. So if you just route that to the front as well, you now have the regular output and the inverted output. This wiring is kind of weird though, so another way to do it is to put the NOR gates side by side and have the outputs crisscross each other on the way back. This makes it way easier to get the regular output and the inverted output. And if you search SR latch on Google Images, you'll notice that this is the most common layout for it. It's the design that you'll see many times if you take a class on digital logic. But in Minecraft, you don't have to use this giant circuit for an SR latch. There are actually some much smaller designs. For example, here's my favorite design for an SR latch. It's absolutely tiny. Here's your set, here's your reset, here's your regular output, and here's your inverted output. The last thing I want to mention about SR latches is that it can be useful to enable them or disable them. You can do this by putting two comparators in the front with a torch. This lever is called the enable signal. When the enable signal is 1, the latch is enabled, so you can set it or reset it just like normal. But when the enable signal is off, the latch is disabled, so you can't mess with it. Very nice. Alright, so SR latches are great, and I use them all the time. But an interesting question is, what happens if you try to set it and reset it at the same time? Well, this is where it gets weird. If you set and reset at the same time, then the output and the inverted output are both 1. Which makes no sense. Something and its inversion should never be the same thing. So this next type of latch, called a data latch, or D-latch, is kind of an attempt to solve that problem. A data latch uses an SR latch as a base, and then it has one input called the data. The data is plugged directly into set, and the inverted version is plugged into reset. The motivation behind this is that when you're using an SR latch, you tend to either be setting and not resetting, or resetting and not setting, which is exactly what this setup forces you to do. So this is a data latch. When the data is 1, the output is 1, and when the data is 0, the output is 0. But that's not very useful, right? I mean, what's the point of having a circuit where the output is just the input? Well, honestly, there isn't one. However, it starts to get interesting when you add an enable signal to a D-latch. If you disable a D-latch, then the output is whatever the data was at the time of disabling it. So this allows us to capture data at a specific time. Think of it this way. When the latch is enabled, it's simply listening to the data and repeating what it hears. But when it gets disabled, it captures the current data in place, and now it's not listening anymore. And this idea of capturing data is so useful that Mojang gave us a way to do it really easily. It's a repeater lock. A repeater lock is literally a D-latch. When it's unlocked, it simply repeats the data, and locking it captures the data. So yeah, if you find yourself needing a D-latch, you don't need to use this big setup. You can just use a repeater lock. And that's it for latches. SR and data are the two main types of latches in digital logic. Finally, let's talk about flip-flops. Flip-flops are extremely similar to latches. As far as I can tell from my research, the main difference is how the enable signal gets used. A latch can be enabled or disabled at will. which means that latches are either constantly responding to the inputs or never responding to the inputs. On the other hand, a flip-flop is meant to be used with a clock. By hooking up a clock to the enable signal, a flip-flop updates itself every clock cycle. And as it turns out, the SR latch and the D latch have a corresponding SR flip-flop and D flip-flop, but they're literally the exact same circuit. The only difference is that the enable signal is hooked up to a clock. I mean, this is the D flip-flop. It's literally just a repeater lock like we had before, but this time it gets quickly unlocked after every clock cycle. This means that on every clock cycle, it gets updated with whatever the current data is. The other flip-flop I want to show you is the toggle flip-flop, or T flip-flop. Every clock cycle, if the input is 1, it toggles. Otherwise, it does nothing. This design uses an SR as a base, but there's actually a much better design for a T flip-flop. This is a tiny T flip-flop using, once again, a repeater lock. When I press this button, the output toggles between on and off. I don't know enough about the game's code to understand how this one actually works, but feel free to explain it in the comments if you know. Now, technically this design isn't exactly a T flip-flop, it's more like a T flip-flop where the main input is always 1 and you are the clock signal when you press this button. But whatever, it's close enough. Ultimately what makes it useful is its ability to toggle. And there are many other designs for a T flip-flop as well, which I've included in the world download. For example, here's a tiny one using an observer and a piston. Now, you might be wondering, what about a T-latch? Is that a thing? Well, even though latches and flip-flops are very similar, I would argue that a T-latch is not a thing. I say that because if you force a T flip-flop to be constantly enabled instead of using a short clock pulse, it just keeps toggling forever. And that is definitely not something a latch should do. So yeah, I don't think a T-latch makes a lot of sense, but everything else here is pretty well defined. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. Last episode we talked about latches and flip-flops. Today we're going to create some really cool sequential circuits. I hope you enjoy. Let's start with some terminology. Back in episode 6, I said that all the circuits in that episode were combinational. The output of a combinational circuit depends on only the input. Once you input something, you automatically know what the output will be. It's predetermined by a truth table. But the circuits we'll see today are not combinational. Instead, they're called sequential. The output of a sequential circuit depends on not just the input, but also the state of the circuit itself. For example, this is the T flip-flop from the previous episode, which toggles whenever the button is pressed. So what will the output be when I press this button? It depends, right? It depends on the state of the T flip-flop. If the previous output was 0, the next one will be 1, and if it was 1, the next one will be 0. Therefore, a T flip-flop is a sequential circuit. In fact, all latches and flip-flops are sequential circuits for the same reasoning. So for the rest of this episode, let's build up a toolbox of some useful sequential devices. Remember that a data latch, or a D latch, can be made with just a repeater lock, and it allows us to capture 1 bit of information. But 1 bit is not very much, so let's stack 8 repeater locks on top of each other and combine all the latching signals together with a glass tower. This is called a register. Specifically, this is an 8-bit register, so it can store any 8-bit number you want. To store a number, simply put it in the back and activate this 2-tick pulse generator to quickly unlock and relock the repeaters. As you can see, the repeater locks are now storing the number. If I want to store a different number instead, I can simply put it here and press the button again. This is called loading a register. Sometimes it's called writing to a register as well, but I prefer saying load. Additionally, it can be useful to have a read function as well. This is an 8-bit register with both load and read. The load button does the same thing as before, loading the repeater locks with the data. But now the data is not shown on the output because it's being cancelled by these comparators. Pressing the read button will quickly uncancel the comparators, giving us an output and allowing us to read the data. Next, let's talk about binary counters. A binary counter stores a binary number, and every time you press the count button, it increments by 1. To make this, I'll start by having a T flip-flop for every single bit, and you'll see why in just a minute. Now, notice from this table that as you count up in binary, the rightmost bit, or the 1 bit, toggles between 0 and 1. You can see the pattern of the 1 bit going 0, 1, 0, 1 forever. So let's just plug the count signal into the rightmost T flip-flop. Now every time we count up, it will toggle between 0 and 1. Okay, so the 1 bit is already done. The next question is, when should the 2-bit toggle? Well, looking at the table again, we can see that the 2-bit toggles whenever the 1 bit is carrying over. In other words, when the 1 bit goes from 1 to 0. And what's really cool is that this property generalizes to any bit when counting up in binary. The 4-bit toggles whenever the 2-bit goes from 1 to 0, and the 8-bit toggles whenever the 4-bit goes from 1 to 0. With Redstone, we can detect this using a torch. A torch will turn on when a signal goes from 1 to 0. So let's put a torch on the output of every T flip-flop and plug them into the toggle signals of the next bit over. When the 1 bit goes from 1 to 0, it will toggle the 2. When the 2 bit goes from 1 to 0, it will toggle the 4, etc. And now, this is a binary counter. When you press the count button, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. This type of counter is called a ripple counter because the toggles ripple across the counter. And you can repeat this pattern for as long as you want to make a counter of any size. Of course, there are many other designs for a ripple counter as well. Here's one made by SethBling that I thought was really cool. It just uses pistons and observers where each piston acts like a T flip-flop. When we give it an update, you can see that on the wool blocks, it's actually counting up in binary. The green wool is 1 and the red wool is 0. And here's another ripple counter I found on Reddit, which is absolutely tiny. It's a little difficult to read the binary, but it's in the observers as they pop out. 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah. Okay, so ripple counters are great, but they suffer from the same problem that the ripple carry adder did. As your counter gets larger, the toggles take longer and longer to propagate. So let's design a synchronous counter, or a counter that always gives an output completely synchronized. To do this, let's start by analyzing the case of 7. When going from 7 to 8, ask yourself this question: why should the 8-bit toggle? If you asked a ripple counter this question, it would say, well, the 1-bit toggled, which toggled the 2, which toggled the 4, and then the 8. But we're smarter than a ripple counter. We have a much better reason, and that is that all the bits to the right of the 8-bit are 1. In fact, the only time any bit toggles is when all the bits to the right of it are 1. I mean, look at what happens when you increment 7. Every single bit gets toggled, because every bit is followed by all 1s. The 8-bit is followed by all 1s, the 4-bit is followed by all 1s, the 2-bit is followed by all 1s, and the 1-bit, well, the 1-bit always toggles. As another example, to increment 1011, or 11, I can just toggle the bits that are followed by all 1s. In this case, that would be the 4-bit, the 2-bit, and the 1-bit. Not the 8-bit because there's a 0 coming after the 8-bit. And sure enough, toggling those bits gives us 1100, which is 12. Perfect. This is the logic behind a synchronous counter. Any bit toggles whenever all the previous bits are 1. And if you want a fun challenge, pause the video now and try making one yourself. I haven't done one of these challenges in a while, so why not bring them back? Alright, welcome back. While you were gone, I found this, which is one of my favorite designs for a synchronous counter. As you can see, there is no rippling. The output is completely synchronized. The way this is implemented with Redstone is actually really clever. Notice that this type of T flip-flop is completely disabled when this redstone is forced on. So if you place a torch on all the previous bits and wire them into the redstone, you've essentially made it so that it can only toggle when all the previous bits are 1. Once they're all 1, all the torches turn off, and now it can toggle. So that's the strategy being used in this synchronous counter. The only way a bit can toggle is once all the previous torches turn off, aka all the previous bits are 1. This counter also has a beautiful vertical design using a glass tower, making it incredibly fast and compact. And it's expandable up to 8 bits. Well, as long as the redstone reaches. You might need a target block at the top. But yeah, I can't express how much I like this design. It's my go-to whenever I need a binary counter. It's small, fast, and of course completely synchronized. Before moving on to the next sequential device, I have one more surprise for you that makes this counter even better. Since the repeater locks are stacked on top of each other now, it's relatively easy to implement a load function as well. This is a synchronous counter with load. To increment the counter, press the count button, and it counts up just like before. But now you can also load it with something else. Simply put the data you want to load here and press load. And if you press the count button again, it will just continue counting from whatever we loaded, which is super cool. And that's about it for binary counters. As always, if you ever want to take a closer look at any of this redstone, the world download is in the description. Next, let's talk about shift registers. A shift register simply stores a number and allows you to shift it. This is an 8-bit shift register that allows you to shift the data upwards. When you press the shift button, the data moves up by 1. To make this, I just took a normal register and plugged every output up into the next highest input. So by unlocking and relocking the repeaters with the shift button, the register gets loaded with the shifted up version of its own data. And here's a version that shifts down instead of up. It looks almost exactly the same. The data just moves down this time. One of the reasons shift registers are so useful is because in binary, shifting up multiplies by 2 and shifting down divides by 2. For example, this is the number 6. Shifting up makes it 12, and shifting down makes it 3. You can also use a horizontal design to shift data to the left or right. This one over here shifts data to the left, and this one shifts data to the right. The one problem with these designs, which you might have already noticed, is that there's no load function. And without a load function, the only way to get data into a shift register is to load it in 1 bit at a time. For example, if I wanted to put a 4 into this, my only option is to load a 1 from the bottom and shift it up twice. So this next device is an upwards shift register with a load function. You can load data by putting it here and pressing load, and you can shift it up by pressing shift. The way this works is with a multiplexer. The shifted data and the load data are both being cancelled by comparators. If you press shift, then the shifted data gets uncancelled and the repeater locks capture it, but if you press load, the load data gets uncancelled and once again the repeater locks capture it. And of course, using this exact same technique, you can add a load function to a downward shift register as well. Next, let's look at a bidirectional shift register. As the name suggests, you can shift the data both up and down using these buttons. And this bidirectional shift register has a load function as well, so you can literally put in any data you want and immediately shift it up or down. Now, it's worth mentioning that you don't need to have 2 sets of repeater locks to make this device. I just chose to do that because it makes the wiring a little bit easier. Honestly, you can just imagine them as 1 set of repeaters because they're always kept the exact same. But with that out of the way, this device is not any more complicated than the previous 2. It's really just another multiplexer. This time it's a 3-way multiplexer between the upshifted data, the downshifted data, and the load data. Whichever option we choose out of these 3 buttons, the corresponding data gets uncancelled and then captured by the repeater locks. Also, bidirectional shift registers can be made horizontally too. Here's a design that I made a long time ago using pistons. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a load function, but you can still shift left and shift right. And the last shifting device I want to show you is a bit of a special one. If you take a shift register with a single bit in it and you plug the output all the way back into the input, it becomes a ring counter. The bit travels around and around the register as if it was on a circus ring, I guess. I actually don't know why they're called ring counters. Someone enlighten me in the comments. But yeah, these come up every once in a while and they can be pretty useful. You can also hook up an encoder to a ring counter and now you have a way to go through any sequence you want. You could make it a binary counter, or a fake prime number generator, or even another ring counter. It's up to you. Next up, this device allows you to keep a running total as you add binary numbers. For example, starting from 0, I can add 3, and then add 2 to the total to get 5, and then add 4 to the total to get 9. This works by combining a register with an adder. Whatever is currently in the register comes around here and gets added with whatever number you want, which is then plugged back into the register. I'm not exactly sure what this device is called. I've heard some people call it an accumulator, but it's possible that it doesn't really have a name. Also, it's worth mentioning that if you just keep the added number as 1, it becomes a binary counter. And if you make the added number all ones, which is -1 in 2's complement, it counts down instead of up. So yeah, I really like this device because it's basically a counter with more freedom. And if you wanted to do a different operation, you could always just swap out the adder for something else. Alright, so all the circuits we've seen so far have only worked with 8 bits at a time. But what if you wanted to work with more memory? Well, you could just make a bigger register, but a better strategy is to combine many registers together into a single system. This is a device that combines 8 registers together into a single memory bank. Each register is given an address, 0 through 7, which is basically that register's unique identifier. Using this input panel, I can write to or read from any of the registers. For example, let's write a 15 to register 3. The 15 goes here, the address of 3 goes here, and then we press write. Let's also write a 10 to register 2. The 10 goes here, the 2 goes here, and write. Now that we've loaded some registers, let's try reading them. I'll put in a 3 and read, and look at that, we get 15. Or if we read what's at address 2, we get 10. Very nice. And let me show you how the actual redstone works too, because I think it's really cool. Basically, the write signal in green is attempting to write to every single register, but it will only go through if that register has been decoded for by this decoder. So by putting an address here, we're unlocking only the register with that address. If I unlock the third register, then when I press write, only the third register gets written to. And it's the exact same idea with the read signal. If I unlock the second register and press read, only the second register gets read. And that's most of the complexity. From there, you just add your registers on top, combine all the inputs together, and combine all the outputs together. Finally, let's talk about some hexadecimal devices. This is a signal strength memory cell. It's just two comparators in a loop. You can think of this like a data latch, but for any signal strength 0 to 15. If I input a 3, the 3 gets stored in the cell. And to store a new number, I can just reset the cell and input something else. I use this type of memory whenever it's more convenient to store hex values than binary values. For example, in my 2048 game, every tile was stored internally as a single hex value. Another useful device is the hexadecimal incrementer/decrementer. When I press this button, the signal strength counts up, and when I press this button, the signal strength counts down. Another cool thing you can do with signal strength is create a decaying signal. This is a comparator loop where the signal strength inside of it will decay by 1 after every cycle. If I input 15, then it decays to 14, 13, 12, etc. This can be used to create super small redstone timers, because when I press this button, the redstone won't turn off for a very long time. Only once the signal on the inside decays to 0 will the redstone finally turn off. Hi guys, and welcome back to Logical Redstone Reloaded. If you're new to the channel or you came from the Piston Extender video, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. To catch you up to speed, this is the 9th episode in a series about building digital logic circuits with just redstone. In the previous episode, we covered sequential devices like registers and counters. Today, we're going to cover displays, both pixel displays and segment displays. There is a lot to talk about today, so let's get started. Let's start with pixel displays. A pixel display is just a rectangular screen full of pixels. But unlike the colorful pixels you're watching this on, pixels in Minecraft typically only have two states, on or off. You can make these displays in many different ways. I've seen them done with pistons to push out or pull in the pixels, or even with dispensers and snow blocks. But the most common way to make them, and my personal favorite, is with redstone lamps. Using a wall of redstone lamps, you can simply power the lamp you want to turn on with a redstone signal. And it's a completely flat screen, which is really nice. The only question is, how big should each pixel actually be? Your first thought might be to make every lamp its own pixel. In Minecraft terms, we would call that a 1x1 density display, because each pixel would be 1 block by 1 block. Unfortunately though, 1x1 density displays are really annoying. If you try to make one yourself, even for something as small as a 4x4 screen, you'll notice that it's kinda difficult to make. Even the best designs in the community tend to use complicated techniques, and a lot of them are really laggy as well. So in my opinion, it's better to make a 2x2 density display, where each pixel is 2 blocks by 2 blocks, or 4 lamps each. This is a stackable module that allows you to power a 2x2 pixel, and you can stack these next to each other to make a display of any size. For example, this is an 8 pixel by 8 pixel display. It's literally just 64 copies of this module. Every pixel now has a dust associated with it in the back that you can use to turn that pixel on. For example, to turn this pixel on, I can just power it right here, and we see it on the screen. Now that we have a basic display, we can do a ton of stuff with it. First up, let's use it to show some images. Let's say that you want to show 3 different images, a smiley face, a sad face, and a surprised face. To do this, we can use a technique shown in the encoder from episode 6. Remember, an encoder allows you to output a unique binary string for each input. This input might give you a certain string, while this other input might give you a different string. And an image on a screen is just a bunch of binary. So using this technique, we can control for which image we want to send to the screen. I'll start by spreading out the pixel lines like this, creating more space above each row. Then I'll create perpendicular blue lines above them, as well as a glass tower to OR them all together. Now to store an image, we can put torches above the pixel lines that make up that image. I'll just stack this 2 more times and store all 3 images. Okay, there we go. Flipping the first lever turns on all the torches attached to these blue lines, which I coded to show the smiley face. Flipping the second lever shows the sad face, and flipping the third lever shows the surprised face. Of course, by changing the positions of these torches, you can store whatever images you want. Very cool. The one thing that kinda sucks about this design is the size. Compared to the screen, it's actually twice as tall. So here's a design by my friend RT, which stays the same size as the screen. Instead of torches, this design uses target blocks to show the image. When you want to show an image, these 4 blue glass towers actually get turned on from underneath using this lever. If there are no target blocks, then the towers won't do anything. They're not connected to any of the pixel lines. But by placing target blocks at the pixel locations of the image, it forces the glass towers to power those pixels. And you can store as many images as you want by stacking this backwards. Okay, I just loaded this with the same 3 images as before, and as you can see, we can send whatever we want to the screen. Beautiful. Next, let's try plotting pixels according to an XY coordinate. I'll say that the bottom left pixel has the coordinate 0, 0. Then for every pixel to the right, X will increase by 1, and for every pixel up, Y will increase by 1. For example, this pixel right here is 2, 3, 2 in X and 3 in Y. To plot a pixel with just an XY coordinate, we can use something called a matrix decoder. A matrix decoder takes in 2 numbers, X and Y, and outputs the corresponding point. Right now, the input is 0, 0, so that's why the bottom left torch is on. But if we input, say, 4, 5, the torch at the coordinate point 4, 5 gets turned on. This works by using a decoder for X, a decoder for Y, and a grid of torches to detect the intersection between them. Notice that every torch in this grid is being powered from 2 places: the row with these redstone lines, and the column with glass towers in the back. Now, since X is currently 4, the 4 line on the decoder gets unpowered, which stops powering that column. And since Y is 5, the 5 line on this decoder gets turned off, which stops powering that row. So, the torch where the 4th column and the 5th row intersect is the only torch that turns on. So, by hooking this up to a display, we can now plot pixels according to their coordinate. If you want to plot pixel 1, 4, then just put a 1 here, a 4 here, and pixel 1, 4 is now on the screen. Pretty cool, right? Next, let's take this one step further and plot multiple pixels onto the same display. To do this, we need every pixel we plot to stay on the screen. So let's put an SR latch from episode 7 onto every single pixel like this. That way, whenever a pixel is activated, it will turn on and stay on until we reset it and turn the pixel back off. Okay, I put the latches on the screen, and now whenever we activate a pixel, it will turn on and stay on. We can literally activate as many as we want, and whatever we put in, that pattern will stay on the screen. Let's go ahead and connect the matrix decoder to this, and we should be able to continuously plot pixels. Alright, there we go. The matrix decoder is going into SR latches and then into the display. Now, you'll notice that the latch for 0, 0 is already on, and that's because technically we're inputting 0, 0 right now. But since we have latches now, it would be nice to have a button that tells the screen when to plot the point, instead of the screen just plotting the point constantly. Okay, I made a little circuit in the front that just cancels everything until the button is pressed. Now we can actually start plotting pixels. You can put in 1, 2, and plot, and it shows up on the screen. Then you can put in something else, like maybe 5, 6, and it'll plot that as well. Also, I wired together all the reset signals from the latches into one button right here. So when you press it, it sets every pixel to 0, which clears the screen. Next, let's explore what happens when we use data latches, again from episode 7, instead of SR latches. This right here is a very similar setup to what we had before. We still have a matrix decoder in the back, but this time every pixel has a repeater lock instead of an SR latch. Now, all the repeater locks on the entire screen are locked by default using these comparators. But when a pixel gets decoded for by the matrix decoder, it quickly unlocks and relocks again. For example, if you input 7, 7 and press the button, you can see that the repeater at 7, 7 opens and closes. And the actual data going into the back of the repeaters is all ORed together using these magenta glass towers into one single lever right here. Whatever this lever is set to, 0 or 1, that's what's trying to go into the back of all the repeaters. So let's try this out. If we set the data to 1 and decode the pixel 2, 3, that pixel will be set to 1 because it grabbed the data. Let's decode another pixel like 4, 5, and as you can see, that gets set to 1 as well. Then if we set the data to 0 and put the pixel back to 2, 3, we can essentially turn that pixel off because, again, it just grabbed the data. So we now have the ability to set any pixel to 1 or 0, which is super cool. There's just one small problem, which is that we lost the ability to reset the whole screen at once. Technically, you could set every pixel to 0 one by one, but that's really time consuming. Luckily though, there's actually a really clever way to add a reset function as well, and it has to do with this decoder. Let me show you what I mean. It turns out that with a little bit of added circuitry in orange, we can force a matrix decoder to turn on all the torches at once. All you have to do is physically prevent all the rows and columns from being powered. With comparators right here, we can force all the rows to be unpowered. And with this redstone line down here, we can force all the columns to be unpowered as well. So now, when you press this button, all the torches turn on. Otherwise, it's still a completely normal matrix decoder. You can still decode for 2, 3, for example, and it'll still work. Okay, great. But how does this give us a reset function? Well, remember, whichever repeater gets decoded for, that's the repeater that grabs the data. So now that we can decode for every pixel at once, we can make every repeater grab the data at once. Putting this all together, the input now looks like this. We have the data, the XY coordinate, the plot pixel button, and the plot all pixels button. If you press plot pixel, then the data gets sent to that specific pixel just like before. But if you press plot all pixels, the data gets sent to every pixel. If the data is 0, every pixel receives a 0. And if the data is 1, every pixel receives a 1. So now our screen has 4 functions. We can set a pixel to 0, set a pixel to 1, set every pixel to 0, and set every pixel to 1. Beautiful. Next, what if you want to use a display for an animation? Well, in that case, the first thing I recommend doing is swapping out all the lamps for trapdoors and using my texture pack to make them look like lamps. This is because trapdoors respond instantly to a redstone signal, whereas redstone lamps take 2 ticks to turn off. And when it comes to animations, it's pretty important for your screen to respond instantly. Now, if you want to make the frames of the animation yourself, then you can probably just use RT's image display from earlier. Just make each image its own frame and then release them one after the other. Each frame will get to the screen slightly after the other, which is exactly what you want. But what if you want to display something that isn't handmade? What if the frames are being drawn by another redstone contraption, like a line drawer? In that case, you might want to use something called a buffer display. The idea behind a buffer display is to let the contraption draw the whole frame first, and then push the frame to the screen once it's done. Let's say I'm the contraption drawing this frame, so I'm going to draw something like a smiley face, for example. Okay, so even though I just drew this smiley face, it doesn't show up on the screen yet. Once you press the button, the frame is sent to the screen. Then let's say the next frame is a bigger smiley face, so I'll go ahead and draw a bigger one. Okay, there we go. And now, when we press this button, it updates to the next frame. The way this works is with SR latches followed by D latches. As we draw a frame, it gets saved into these SR latches, which are not connected to the screen. Then, when we press this button, 2 things happen. First, all the data latches unlock and relock, which captures the frame that we just drew. And second, it resets all the SR latches so that it's ready for the next frame to be drawn. And you can actually achieve this with just 1 glass tower for every column. This dust on the left is flashing the D latch, and this dust on the right is resetting the SR latch. So yeah, this buffer technique is super cool. If you combine this with something like a line drawer or a computer, you can create some pretty cool animations. Next, I want to show you an amazing redstone technique called pass-through, which was invented by these guys right here. Pass-through is the idea of using multiple matrix decoders to plot to the same screen at once. When I first learned about pass-through, I was blown away, because I didn't even think it was possible. I mean, how can you pass the result of one decoder through the other without interfering with anything? It just seems like a logistical nightmare. But it's completely possible, and here's how it works. First, consider this new design for a matrix decoder. Even though it looks quite a bit different, it has the exact same functionality as before. If you turn on a specific column and a row, you get the intersection between them. It's just that this time we're using comparators instead of torches. Every output has one comparator associated with it, which is getting cancelled on both sides. It's being cancelled from the row with these repeaters and the column with these glass towers. If the glass tower for that column and the repeater for that row both turn off, then the comparator is not being cancelled from either side and we get an output. Now, the question is, can you pass signals through this such that they connect to the outputs without messing with anything? Amazingly, you can, and it looks like this. If I power one of these 4 lamps, the corresponding lamp shows up on the final output. What we're doing here is using a comparator to put a signal through this block, into this dust, and into the final output. But you might be wondering, doesn't that just mess with the Y decoder line? Well, no, because it's being forced to have a signal strength of 1, which does not get picked up by the other repeaters on this line. That's the key behind this technique. So now, if you put another matrix decoder behind this and plug the outputs into these inputs, you can decode from multiple points at the same time. You can decode for the bottom right with this one, and for the top left with this one. They both show up on the display. So yeah, that's the idea behind pass-through. Here's an 8x8 version instead of 2x2 using the exact same technique. The only slightly weird thing about this is that the x-coordinate is on the right this time. But in any case, let's go ahead and plot 2, 3 on this one, and 4, 5 on this one. And they both show up on the screen. Nice. So if you happen to watch my 3D renderer video, hopefully the display makes a little bit more sense now. It's essentially a giant pass-through display with 6 layers of pass-through, as well as a buffer on the front. This allowed me to draw many lines at once and push the frame to the screen when it finished. Finally, I want to briefly talk about color displays. So far in this video, all the displays only use 2 colors. But what if you want to add more? Is an RGB display possible in Minecraft? Well, not really, but over the years, I've seen some color displays that I think deserve some attention. The first type of color display is called a map display, using an actual Minecraft map. You see, the color of a pixel on a map is decided by the majority of the colors in that region. So let's say that a map is looking at this 4x4 region of blocks to decide which color the pixel should be. Currently, there's no majority, because every block is a different color. But if you place a red block here, red becomes the majority. Or if you place a blue block, blue becomes the majority. So yeah, these displays typically use pistons to change the majority and thus change the color of a pixel. You can also make a color display with the help of a texture pack. In this display, created by Torb, every pixel has a red, green, and blue slice, where each slice can be covered up by a certain number of trapdoors. This gives you up to 64 different colors. The texture pack to go along with it makes open trapdoors invisible and closed trapdoors completely black. This lets you control how much red, green, and blue is visible, similar to RGB pixels in real life. And finally, in this display by Mod Punchtree, each redstone dust signal strength has been retextured to a separate color, giving you up to 16 colors to use. This one is personally my favorite color display. It looks really clean, and you can change which colors you want to use by just changing the texture pack. Now, I also want to mention that any display you see in this video can be made bigger than 8x8. However, it probably won't be as simple as just running //stack. In many cases, signal strength will become an issue, especially if you have glass towers. So if you need to extend a glass tower beyond the normal 8 bits, here are my 2 favorite techniques. You can use a repeater going backwards like this, and make sure to make this block a solid block. Or you can use 2 torches like this, and once again, make sure this block is a solid block. I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten that and wondered why this specific repeater wasn't working. Also, it's a good idea to keep your glass towers synchronized. Notice that these repeaters in gray are going to take 1 more tick to power than the bottom 8. So I recommend adding 1 tick of delay to the bottom 8 repeaters. Now when you power it, they all get there at the exact same time. And if you use torches, you should add 2 ticks of delay to the bottom 8 repeaters, because this torch tower takes 2 ticks. As you can see, this keeps it nice and synchronized. But yeah, honestly, I highly recommend sticking with an 8x8 screen unless absolutely necessary. A working screen is infinitely more impressive than a big screen. Alright, let's switch gears and talk about the world of segment displays. Segment displays use specialized segments instead of pixels. They're typically used to show numbers or letters. The most common segment display is called the 7-segment display. They use, you guessed it, 7 segments to display anything from 0 to 9, as well as A through F. And these are actually the only segment displays I'm going to cover in this video. Check out the links in the description if you want to learn about displays with other numbers of segments. So to start us off, let's make a circuit that goes from any number 0 to 9 to a 7-segment display. We'll talk about A through F later. When you input 3, it should show 3. Or when you input 9, it should show a 9. And if you input something greater than 9, it should show nothing. The first step is to figure out which value is being input, because each one is going to show something different. So let's use a decoder to decode for every value from 0 to 9. If you input 3, the torch for number 3 will turn on. Then let's hook up a wire to every segment and arrange them like this above the decoder. And finally, let's make a glass tower for every number and encode the segments with repeaters. And that's pretty much it. So now if you input a 5, for example, the torch for number 5 turns on, which activates this glass tower, powering these segments for 5. And as you can see, we get a nice 5 on the display. If you input an 8 instead, you get an 8. Perfect. This is one of my favorite designs because it's extremely fast, and you can stack them really close together horizontally. But of course, there are many other ways to make this. Here's another design that I've used quite a bit in the past. This time we have a flat decoder on the top, which decodes into a green line. Then on both of these layers, the green line encodes the segments using these torches. And as you can see, it does the same thing. Just keep in mind that unlike this guy, this design is completely unsynced. When you input a number, you'll probably get some random garbage on the output until it finishes. However, this design has a much more natural shape, so you can stack it decently close horizontally and vertically. So that's pretty cool. So using many copies of these converters, you can now display any number. If you have 3 of them, you can input 1, 2, 3, and you get 123 on the display. This notation, where each decimal digit is a 4-bit binary number, actually has a special name. It's called BCD, which stands for Binary Coded Decimal. For example, the number 347 in BCD looks like this: 4 bits for 3, 4 bits for 4, and 4 bits for 7. So this device is called a BCD to 7-segment converter because it takes a single BCD digit and displays it on 7 segments. But this begs the question, what if you want to convert a binary number larger than 9 into BCD? In other words, how could you go from a binary number like 123 to a BCD number so that you can actually display it on a 7-segment display? Well, I've actually covered this in a previous video called Binary to BCD. In that video, I made this really cool device that converts a binary number into its BCD form. For example, if you input 69 in binary and go ahead and press this button, you get 69 in BCD. You can then plug that BCD into some converters, and now you can see the number on a screen. So yeah, check out that video if you want to learn more about this device. And apologies for the lower quality, it's from about 2 years ago. Okay, let's show some letters now. As I said earlier, 7-segment displays can also show A through F. This means that a single 7-segment display can show a hex digit. Remember from episode 2 that in hexadecimal, 10 represents A, 11 represents B, all the way to 15, which represents F. So we can literally just add 6 more lines to our converter for A through F. And now this is a hex to 7-segment converter. And what's really cool is we don't have to add any more bits to the input. 4 bits of binary has the exact same range as 1 hex digit. 0000 is 0, and 1111 is F. And of course, you can also add 6 more lines to the other design as well. Another thing you can do is hook up a signal strength to binary converter from episode 6, and now you can display signal strength. If you put in a strength of 4, you get 4. Or if you put in a 12, you get C, which is 12 in hexadecimal. Additionally, if you want to display a large binary number in hex, it's extremely straightforward. You can just plug each 4-bit chunk of the number into its own converter. For example, let's say you wanted to display the binary number 10001011 in hexadecimal. This number is equal to 139, by the way. I'll put the first 4-bit chunk, 1011, into the first converter, and the second 4-bit chunk, 1000, into the second converter. This gives us 8B on the display. Therefore, this binary number, or 139, is equal to 8B in hex. So, in summary, showing a binary number in decimal, that's kinda hard. First you have to convert to BCD, and then convert each BCD digit into 7-seg. But showing a binary number in hex, that's easy. Just plug each 4 bits directly into a hex to 7-seg converter. And finally, I want to show you some of the most interesting 7-segment displays from the community. This right here is a 7-segment counter designed by Mizuma Games. Every time this observer receives an update, the display counts up by 1. And whenever it goes from 9 to 0, it gives an output on the other side, which means that if you stack these next to each other, you now have a multi-digit counter. This is super useful, especially for keeping score in a Redstone game. I used it for my Flappy Bird game and also in Dance Dance Revolution. And now, the last family of devices in this video. And trust me when I say I saved the best for last. This is an incredible piece of technology designed by Powsy and Amino. In essence, it's a hex to 7 segment converter with a signal strength input. So you can put in a 3 in the back and you get a 3 on the screen. However, the number is way smaller than the one on my design. But why is that? Isn't the size of this thing just going to make the numbers spread out anyways when it stacks? Well, if you take this entire module and paste it so that there's just one block of space between the numbers, both modules still work. You can put a 3 here and a 7 here, and they'll both show up on the screen. And not only horizontally, but vertically too, making this display incredibly tiny. Also, notice that the numbers are kind of fancy. These don't really look like segments anymore, they look like they were drawn on by hand. This is because there are actually no segments. Each display is a tiny pixel display, so the way that every number and letter looks has been customized by the creators. Also, here's a slightly smaller design, but this one will only show 0 through 9. Anything above 9 will just show up blank. And it gets even smaller if you don't care about it being fully lamps as well. This tiny thing can still decode for any number from 0 to 9. The numbers are completely out of order this time, but it's still really impressive. So how in the world do these work? Well, if you look at them, you'll see that they all use a repeating diagonal pattern of comparators and barrels. As it turns out, by changing the number of items in these barrels, you can get it to produce many different patterns. So the creators of this literally brute forced millions of different barrel combinations using software, which allowed them to find the exact combination that produces the patterns they want. That's how the creators were not only able to go from 0 to F, but customize how each one looks as well. So yeah, I thought I'd show you this because it's both the smallest and nicest looking display I've ever seen, and the technology behind it is just fascinating.
Hi guys, and welcome to the final episode of Logical Redstone Reloaded. Today we'll be making 2 entire Redstone games from scratch, Lights Out and Connect 4. I'm also going to be giving you guys some tips and tricks about the game design process so that you can apply them to your own games. I hope you enjoy. So what's the best way to make a Redstone game? Looking out at the blank sandstone world, making a game can feel like an extremely daunting task. Should you start building things right away? Should you draw things out on paper maybe? I mean, where do you even start? Unfortunately, there's no magic formula for how you should build a game. Everyone is different, and it's too complex to put into a formula. But I have some tips that I want to share with you. These are from my own experience and from what I've seen in the Redstone community over the years. And a lot of these tips also apply to any computer science project, not just a Redstone game. But again, it's important to remember that there is no magic formula. So if my advice doesn't work, that's okay. My goal for this video is to just be as helpful for as many people as possible. So, what are these tips? My first big tip is to plan as much as possible outside of Minecraft before you start building anything. It might seem silly at first, but I recommend taking out a sheet of paper and actually drawing the build. Or if you have a drawing program on your computer, you can use that too. Now, don't draw every single wire, just draw the general idea. Make some boxes for the components you might need, and draw the general connections between them. The main reason I recommend this is efficiency. Building redstone is slow, but drawing on paper is really fast. And as you draw, you might realize there's an issue with it, like maybe something you didn't think about until you saw it visually. Trust me, it's much better to find an issue before you start building rather than after you've already built a ton of redstone. Another option when it comes to planning is to program your game first. I've actually done this a few times. For example, I made my 2048 game in Python before building it. This becomes especially useful when you want to compare the output of your game to the correct simulated output, assuming that what you coded is actually correct. But regardless of your code's correctness, this is still a great option because you'll learn way more about the inner workings of your game by programming it. And if you don't have any experience, well, it's never too late to start. Programming is one of the most useful skills you can possibly have, and there are so many resources for it online. I'll put a few of my favorites in the description. My next big tip is to use something called abstraction. Within computer science, abstraction means to abstract lower-level details into a higher-level function. In other words, keeping the implementation separate from the functionality. For example, to drive a car, there are really only 3 things that you need to know. The gas pedal makes it go, the brake makes it stop, and the wheel steers it. Those are pretty much the only functions you need to operate a car. You don't have to know how the engine works or how the circuits work or anything. That's the implementation. So applying this to Redstone, take this multiplier for example, which multiplies 2 binary numbers together. I don't know all the details about how it works because I didn't make it. My friend Sloimy did. But just like a car, I don't have to know how it works to use it. All I have to know is that the 2 inputs are right here and the output is right here. 3 times 3 is 9. So you can essentially use other people's redstone without having to know how it works. But abstraction isn't just about using other people's work. The real power of abstraction is the ability to build machines that get more and more complex without it actually feeling like it's getting more complex. To show you what I mean, let's say I wanted to make an 8-bit binary adder, just like in episode 4. To do this, I would start by making the basic logic gates, and once I know how to make them, I can just view them as little symbols, each with input and output. Then I don't have to worry about the implementation anymore. Now, using these symbols, I can construct a half adder. And a half adder is, once again, just defined by some inputs and outputs. So I can make a symbol to represent the entire half adder. Then, using some half adders and another logic gate, I can make a full adder. And finally, using 8 full adders, I can make an 8-bit adder. Notice that at every stage, I never did anything super complex. But if you open up the 8-bit adder and look at all the logic inside, it's pretty complicated. So when you're building your own Redstone game, try to use this technique to your advantage. Start by breaking things down into smaller and smaller components, and then build your way back up using abstraction. My third tip is to use mods, because they can save you a ton of time. In the very first episode of this series, I told you guys about my 2 favorite mods, World Edit and Carpet. And I can't stress this enough, learning how to use these 2 mods will save you so much time. Also, one thing I forgot to mention in that first video is that World Edit has a schematic feature, which allows you to save Redstone builds and paste them in later. You can use this to transfer builds between worlds or even send them to your friends. Another really cool mod for Redstone is called Redstone Tools, which was developed a little bit after that first episode. I made a video going through its features. It's a quality of life mod that's literally designed by people like me to save your time. Finally, my last tip is not really Redstone related, but it's still really important. Take breaks and take care of yourself. I know it seems like it's not that big of a deal to play Minecraft for hours and hours on end, because it's just a video game. But when you're making a literal game out of Redstone, you're not just playing a video game anymore. You're making a project. And when you're working on a project, you need breaks. Otherwise, you'll burn out really quickly, and ultimately, you won't finish. But I think that's about it when it comes to tips. Let's start making some games. But first, I have to clarify something real quick. At the time of recording this, I've actually already made these games off camera. So if it seems like I'm super lucky because I'm not running into any issues, I'm not. It's just that I've already done all the debugging. Debugging is definitely a huge part of the process, and I'm sorry that it's not going to be in this video very much, but for the purposes of causing as little confusion as possible, I just thought it'd be best to make these games as if everything works perfectly first try. With that out of the way, our first game to make is called Lights Out. Lights Out is played on a board of square cells, where each cell can be on or off. When you click on a cell, it toggles its state, as well as the state of the 4 adjacent neighbors. You start off with a certain configuration of on cells, and the goal of the game is to turn all the lights off. For example, if the pattern looks like this, I can turn off all the lights by clicking this one, this one, this one, and this one. One thing to keep in mind is that not all starting patterns are solvable. For example, this simple 2x1 board is impossible to completely turn off. But the cool thing is, you can actually generate a complex and solvable board really easily. All you have to do is start with a fully off board and click on it in random places. You know that it has a solution because you can always just do what you did in reverse. Okay, so let's start drawing our design. The first thing I notice about Lights Out is that all the cells have the exact same functionality. So in theory, we can just build one cell and then duplicate it to make a board of any size. From the top-down view, let's make the cell out of a bunch of lamps to show whether it's on or off, and then let's have a note block in the middle for the player to click on it. Now, when the player clicks the note block, 2 things have to happen. The cell has to toggle its own state, and it has to toggle the state of the 4 neighbors. The simplest way to do this is to just have a T flip-flop underneath every cell. I covered T flip-flops in episode 7. When the player clicks the note block, we'll send a signal down to the T flip-flop to toggle it, as well as a signal to the 4 neighbors' T flip-flops. And that's literally it. That's our design. Back in Minecraft, let's go ahead and build the 3x3 of lamps and put a note block in the middle. And let's also put a border around it so that it's easier to tell the cells apart. There we go. Perfect. And then for the T flip-flop underneath, let's go ahead and do a few observers into a block, into a sticky piston, into a redstone block. So when you click on the note block, it sends a short pulse down and it toggles the piston. If you put a lamp right here, you can see that it toggles between off, on, off. You get the idea. Now, eventually we want the lamps on top to toggle, not the one down there, but let's just worry about that later. I think the more important thing is to figure out how to toggle the other 4 neighbors as well. We need some system such that when I click this note block, the T flip-flop underneath it toggles, and all 4 of these toggle as well. The first way I thought to do this was to just split the observer line into 4 and plug it into all 4 neighbors like this. And technically this works because when you toggle it, it toggles its 4 neighbors. The problem is the wiring is so dense that you're essentially screwing yourself over. Remember, these 4 cells on the outside see the center as their neighbor, which means you're going to end up having 4 more signals plug into the center piston, and there's barely any room as is. I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but it just gets really messy. The better approach is to do something like this, where there's a redstone line between each pair of blocks. Now, when you toggle the center, it puts a signal onto all 4 redstone lines and toggles all 4 neighbors. And if I toggle this cell, for example, it'll toggle itself and it will reuse just this redstone line to toggle its one neighbor. So now we have exactly the functionality we want. And this is a super easy system to expand. You can literally just make a grid following this pattern. Now if I toggle any cell, we can see that it toggles itself and the 4 neighbors. Perfect. And at this point, if you want to play lights out, you technically can. You just have to use the display on the bottom. But let's go ahead and connect the T flip-flop to the display on the top. Okay, so I just added this cyan circuit, which takes the output of the T flip-flop and turns on all the lamps. So if we go to toggle it, you can see we get that nice spiral pattern turning on, turning off. All we have to do now is duplicate this a bunch of times and we'll have lights out. Okay, here's a nice 3x3 board. Every cell is on right now, and as it turns out, that's a solvable pattern. If you want to try to solve this in your head or on paper, go ahead. I'll give you a second to pause the video. Alright, so the solution is to do all 4 corners like this, and the center one. And all the lights are out, so we win. So yeah, that's lights out with Redstone. Just a T flip-flop for every cell and a little bit of a clever wiring technique. I've included a 3x3, 5x5, and 7x7 board in the world download if you want to play it yourself. The link for that is in the description. Remember, all you have to do to make a solvable pattern is to just start with them all off and click squares randomly. So maybe have a friend do that or something, and then you can challenge yourself to turn all the lights out. The next game I want to make with you guys is Connect 4. This is a pretty well-known game, but just in case, here's how it works. Connect 4 is a 2-player game, and it's typically played on a 7x6 board that looks like this. One player drops yellow chips, and the other drops red chips. The players alternate back and forth, dropping 1 chip at a time, and the first one to get 4 in a row wins the game. The 4 in a row can be horizontal, vertical, or even diagonal. The absolute easiest way to make this game in Minecraft is to actually just use sand and gravel like this, but come on, that's kind of boring. Let's make this using actual digital logic. The first thing I notice about this game is that every column can be thought of individually. Dropping a chip in one column doesn't affect any of the other columns. So we can just build one column and duplicate it. And according to the original game size, the column is going to be 6 cells tall. Now, each one of these cells has to be able to display 3 different things: red chip, yellow chip, and empty. But as you probably know, color displays are not great, and I'd rather just use redstone lamps. So let's just represent yellow and red with the symbols X and O on redstone lamps. And when it's empty, it'll be completely off. That'll look pretty good. But now, let's think about how this will actually work. First things first, we know that every cell is going to need some type of memory to store the current state of the cell. And since there are 3 states, X, O, and empty, that memory needs to be at least 2 bits. We can't do it with 1 bit because 1 bit can only store 2 things. but 2 bits can store 4 things. So let's get really specific about the logic we need here. When the game starts, every cell will be in the empty state. On X's turn, if they happen to choose this column, we need to replace the lowest empty cell with an X. And same thing for O's turn. If they choose this column, we'll replace the lowest empty cell with an O. But finding the lowest empty cell is not the easiest thing in the world. I mean, how do you do that with digital logic? Well, the most straightforward algorithm is to just start at the top, check the cell underneath. If it's empty, move down. If it's not, stop. And repeat this until it goes down as far as possible. So at first glance, it seems like we're going to need some type of shift register, like from episode 8. And while you can make connect 4 with shift registers, there's actually a better way to do it using just SR latches from episode 7. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine for a second that every cell has an SR latch behind it. If the latch is reset, that means the cell is empty. And if it's set, it's occupied. For now, don't worry about whether it's an X or an O. Just think of the cells as either empty or occupied, according to what the SR latch says. Now, whenever a player wants to drop a chip, all we have to do is this. From top to bottom, send a set signal to every SR latch, and if any latch becomes set, reset the latch above it. For example, let's drop our first chip. We start by setting this guy, and there's no one above it, so we don't have to worry about any resetting. Then we set this one, and because it became set, let's reset the one above it. Then we set this one, and again, it became set, so reset the one above it, and keep doing this all the way down until you get to the bottom. Now let's drop another chip. So again, start by setting this top guy, and there's no one above it. Then set this one, it became set, so reset the one above it, and continue this all the way down. Notice that when you go to set the bottom cell, it stays the way it is, and more importantly, it didn't become set, and so we don't reset the latch above it. And there we go, we dropped another chip. So yeah, if you just set every latch top to bottom and follow this one rule, you can essentially drop a chip on a column. The only other thing we have to think about is how to distinguish between X and O. But for that, I think it's actually just easier to show you in Minecraft. So let's head on over and start building. As usual, I'll start with making the display. Alright, I made a vertical column with a 3x3 of lamps for each cell. And then let's have this be O and this be X. I know this is more of a plus than an X, but when it's only 3x3, the plus looks much better. So next, let's make the display logic for a single cell so that it can actually show these based on some redstone inputs. We're going to need 2 input wires, one for X and one for O, and depending on which one gets activated, that's just what the cell will show. Okay, done with that. So as you can see, when we power this one, we get an O, and when we power this one, we get an X. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this for every cell in the column. There we go. Now we can display an X or an O on any cell, which is perfect. Next, let's make the circuit I was talking about that will simulate gravity. I'm going to do this step by step. To start, every cell just has an SR latch behind it. That's all I've done so far. So you can go to any cell and you can reset it, or you can set it, and you can see the state of the latches with these lamps right here. Now remember, when the player drops a chip, the first thing we want to do is literally just set all the latches, top to bottom. Let's do that with a downward torch tower. Okay, there's the torch tower, and as you can see, it literally just sets every cell. Now we just need to make our special rule. The rule says that if a latch becomes set, it resets the latch above it. To do this, we can actually use the pulse generator from episode 7, because a pulse generator, at least in the way I described it, is really just a rising edge detector. In other words, when the signal behind it goes from low to high, it outputs a short pulse. So if we just take this and attach it to the state of the cell, then we'll get a pulse whenever the cell becomes set. And by plugging the output into the next highest reset, that's our rule. So let's duplicate this for every cell, and we should have a gravity circuit. Okay, let's try this out. If we press this button, we drop a chip. And if we press it again, we drop another one. Beautiful. These circuits always feel so magical, because it almost looks like a physics simulation or something, but no, it's just latches and a rule. So yeah, we have gravity now. The last thing we need to think about is how to switch between player X and player O. Like I said earlier, we know that every cell needs at least 2 bits of information to store its 3 states. And there's actually a really elegant way to store 2 bits of information with a single redstone component. No, not the comparator, I'm talking about the repeater. Because repeaters are not only on or off, they're also locked or unlocked, giving us a total of 4 different states. So, here's how this is going to work. We're going to have a repeater like this for every cell in the column. If the repeater is unlocked, that means the cell is empty. If it's locked, that means the cell is occupied. If it's locked with a 0, it's an O. And if it's locked with a 1, it's an X. Let me go ahead and duplicate this so we have one for every cell. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug the output of the gravity circuit into these locking signals that are on the left. There we go, just like this. And now we can drop a chip for X or O. Let me show you what I mean. If we press this button, which sends a signal all the way down in our gravity circuit, it's going to come all the way down to here and lock the bottommost repeater. And if we look at the display, we can see that there's an O on the bottom because the repeater got locked with a 0. That makes sense because we weren't powering the back of any of the repeaters. But now, let's say it's X's turn. So I'm going to go ahead and power the back of every single repeater. So if we press this button again, the gravity circuit sends another signal down, which locks another repeater, but this time it got saved with a 1, which is X. So let me just combine all these signals together and we should be able to control whether an X or an O gets dropped. Okay, I connected them all with a spiral and I put a lever right here. So now when the lever's on, it drops an X. And when the lever's off, of course, it drops an O. Beautiful. Building the rest of the game was pretty straightforward. I just duplicated the column 6 more times, and I added a reset function, which resets all the SR latches in the entire board. And I added some note blocks at the top of each column so that the player can just right-click any of those and it'll drop a chip. And I like doing that because it's a much bigger hitbox than a button. Alright, here's the finished game. When this lever is up, it's X's turn, and they can drop a chip wherever they want. And when the lever is down, it's O's turn. And of course, they can do the same thing. They can drop a chip wherever they want. And oh my, I love the falling animation. It's really cool. We didn't do any win-lose detection or anything like that, but I'm gonna be honest, I really don't feel like it. Also, it's kind of annoying to have to flip this lever every time, so you could make a circuit to just switch whoever's turn it is whenever a chip is dropped. That wouldn't be too bad. You could probably just do that with a T flip-flop.